Hey, guys. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's begin with the big guy himself, Zeus, god of the sky, ruler of Olympus, and walking proof that absolute power absolutely fries your sense of boundaries. Zeus was the youngest son of Cronus and Rhea. His dad, like all great fathers, had a habit of swallowing his children whole to prevent them from overthrowing him. Romantic. Fortunately, Rhea saved baby Zeus by tricking Cronus with a rock and a blanket, which tells you a lot about how closely this guy paid attention. Once Zeus grew up, he led a divine rebellion against Cronus, sliced open his father's stomach. Freud would have a field day and freed his siblings, Poseidon, Hades, Hera, Hestia, and Demeter. Boom, the original dysfunctional family was born. After the gods won the war against the Titans, Zeus became king. He ruled the heavens, controlled thunder and lightning, and was in charge of cosmic order, justice, and oaths. In theory, that is. In practice, Zeus spent most of his time transforming into various animals and seducing anything with a pulse. Swans, bulls, eagles, golden mist. The man had no chill and no consistent moral code. Imagine your country's Supreme Court justice turning into a goose to flirt with civilians. That's Zeus, but with more lightning. His love life was an open-source disaster. He married his sister Hera, which went about as well as you'd expect. He had dozens of affairs with goddesses, nymphs, mortals, and probably one or two houseplants. The result? An overwhelming number of demigod children, many of whom had serious parental abandonment issues and accidentally foundered entire mythologies. But despite all that, Zeus wasn't entirely chaotic. When he wasn't cheating or chucking lightning bolts at mortals who didn't offer proper sacrifices, he did act as the cosmic referee. He enforced oaths, upheld law, and occasionally punished people for being more arrogant than he was, which, frankly, took effort. Zeus was respected, feared, and constantly causing PR nightmares for Olympus. He had power, presence, and zero understanding of personal space. He was both protector and predator, judge and joke, the ultimate divine contradiction. Hera is technically the goddess of marriage, family, and childbirth, which is ironic because her own marriage is an absolute dumpster fire in a golden chariot. She's Zeus's wife, also his sister, because, mythology. Their wedding was supposed to be the divine ideal of sacred union. Instead, it turned into a centuries-long soap opera filled with infidelity, revenge, and a shocking number of people turned into animals or trees or stone. Hera is powerful, the undisputed queen of the gods. Her power mostly expresses itself in one very specific way: vengeance. Not on Zeus, of course. No, that would be too simple. Hera's fury is laser-focused on the women Zeus seduces, or let's be honest, outright kidnaps and their unfortunate children. She once turned a woman into a cow, cursed another to only speak in echoes, and in one particularly cruel moment, tried to kill baby Hercules with a pair of serpents. That was literally his baby. Hers. No. Still no. It's hard to blame her entirely. Imagine being the goddess of marriage while your husband is out here inventing new forms of animal-based flirtation. But still, her divine coping mechanisms often included eternal curses and elaborate punishments. Therapy wasn't a thing in ancient Greece, so revenge was the next best option. Yet despite all that, Hera wasn't just a celestial grudge holder. She also protected women in childbirth, upheld the sanctity of marriage theoretically, and punished oaths broken by mortals. She had temples, priests, and a devoted cult following. Cities like Argos and Samos worshipped her as a major force of divine order. In short, Hera was the goddess you prayed to when your husband was faithful, and the one who probably sent a plague when he wasn't. She's a fascinating paradox. The embodiment of female dignity and power in a system that constantly humiliated her. Her story isn't just about jealousy. It's about a woman who was supposed to symbolize unity while holding Olympus together with pure spite and decorative fury. Poseidon was the god of the sea, earthquakes, storms, and for some reason, horses. Because nothing says ocean god like a herd of galloping stallions. But hey, mythology. He was one of the three main brothers. Zeus got the sky, Hades got the underworld, and Poseidon got everything wet, which suited him just fine. He ruled over the vast oceans, commanded sea creatures both beautiful and nightmarish, and wielded a massive trident. Not just a pointy fork, but a three-pronged divine rage stick capable of leveling entire cities. Poseidon was revered and feared in equal measure. Sailors prayed to him for safe passage. Fishermen made offerings. City builders asked his permission before putting anything too close to the shoreline, lest it become beachfront property by accident. But let's be honest, Poseidon had issues. Big, crashing, tidal wave-sized emotional issues. He was the classic unpredictable uncle, sometimes generous, sometimes devastating, always a bit salty. One moment, he's creating islands. Next, he's flooding your crops because someone forgot to thank him during a sacrificial goat ceremony. He once struck the ground so hard with his trident that he caused an earthquake just because he lost a city naming contest to Athena. Seriously. She gave Athens an olive tree. He offered a saltwater spring. The people chose olives. He chose vengeance. That's Poseidon in a nutshell. He also had a rather complicated love life. There were nymphs, mortals, even one incident involving Medusa, which ended with her getting snake hair and a monster label, and him walking away without consequences. Classic. Despite all that, Poseidon wasn't just a stormy brood. He was a protector of seafarers, a builder of cities, and in his calmer moments, a god of prosperity and fertility. He was essential to ancient Greek life, especially for a culture so dependent on the sea. But like the ocean itself, he was always one storm away from reminding everyone who was really in charge. Hades is the god of the underworld. Not hell exactly, but a vast, gloomy realm where all souls eventually clock out for eternity. Contrary to modern pop culture, Hades wasn't evil. He wasn't even particularly cruel. He was just incredibly tired of everyone. While Zeus got the sky and Poseidon got the seas, Hades drew the short straw and got stuck managing the ancient Greek version of customer service for the dead. For eternity in darkness, surrounded by wailing, Hades ruled the underworld with a quiet, brooding authority. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't loud. He didn't throw lightning or crash weddings. He just showed up to work every day, managing the logistics of eternity and making sure souls didn't sneak out the back. The ultimate middle manager. His domain was called Hades too, because apparently naming a kingdom after yourself wasn't a red flag back then. It had sections for the heroic Elysium, the average Asphodel, and the truly awful Tartarus, ancient Greece's version of a very long detention. And guess who had to oversee all of it? That's right, Hades, the goth workaholic of the gods. Now about Persephone. Yes, he kidnapped her. Not great, definitely problematic. But also, Greek mythology is nothing if not inconsistent. They actually grew into a functional, weirdly stable marriage. She spent half the year with him, bringing life to the underworld, and the other half on Earth, causing spring. It's less romance, more mythological timeshare. Hades was also the original pet dad. His dog, Cerberus, had 3 heads, a temper, and 0 obedience training. But he kept souls in line, mostly. Unlike his brothers, Hades didn't cheat, didn't rage, and didn't crave the spotlight. That's probably why ancient Greeks rarely built temples for him. They were terrified of attracting his attention. He was the quiet, grim uncle you didn't invite to the party, but still respected from a safe, polite distance. Athena is the goddess of wisdom, war strategy, handicrafts, and staying 10 steps ahead of everyone without breaking a sweat. She's basically the divine embodiment of logic in a world full of emotional wrecks with lightning bolts. Her birth alone is enough to give Freud nightmares. Zeus, after swallowing her pregnant mother, Metis, because prophecy, of course, developed a splitting headache. Instead of aspirin, he got a hammer to the skull and out popped Athena, fully grown, fully armored, and fully unimpressed with everyone. From day one, Athena made it clear she was not here for nonsense. Unlike her war-happy brother Ares, Athena viewed conflict like a chessboard, something to be analyzed, controlled, and won with minimal shouting and maximum efficiency. If Ares was a chaotic bar fight, Athena was a war room with spreadsheets. She's also the goddess of crafts, which might seem out of place until you realize weaving in her hands was a battlefield. Just ask Arachne, a mortal who dared challenge Athena to a weaving contest. Arachne won technically, but was then turned into a spider for being a little too talented. Moral of the story: be humble or enjoy your new life in the corner of someone's ceiling. Athena stayed out of romance entirely. Unlike the rest of Olympus, she didn't seduce mortals, marry her brother, or transform into questionable animals. She simply had things to do. Cities to protect, heroes to advise, owls to raise. She guided Odysseus home, helped Perseus behead Medusa, and probably edited the Iliad with a red pen. Athena is the goddess you'd want on your debate team, in your war council, or running your startup. She doesn't scream. She doesn't scheme. She simply outsmarts. Always. Ares was the Greek god of war, bloodshed, and punching first, thinking never. If Athena was at war with a blueprint, Ares was at war with a sledgehammer and poor impulse control. He represented the brutal, raw chaos of battle. The part where screaming men charged into each other and no one really knew what was happening except that things were on fire and someone just lost a helmet. In short, if Ares shows up, things are about to get loud, violent, and deeply disorganized. Personality-wise, he wasn't exactly Olympus's favorite guest. Even his fellow gods didn't like him. Zeus once called him the most hateful of all the gods. And, you've messed up when Zeus is calling you a problem. Ares was arrogant, hot-headed, and about as subtle as a flaming chariot. He wasn't particularly respected either. The Greeks admired strategy, restraint, and cleverness, things Ares consistently failed to bring to the table. He didn't win battles with tactics, he just stormed in swinging. That worked occasionally, but more often than not, it left a trail of dead bodies and deeply annoyed allies. That said, Ares was still terrifying. He was the god of fear, literally. His sons were named Phobos and Deimos, aka Panic and Terror, and he loved being in the thick of a brawl. He also had an affair with Aphrodite, which sounds romantic until you remember it ended with him getting caught in an invisible net by her husband, Hephaestus, and laughed at by the entire pantheon. Ancient Greek tabloids had a field day. In Roman mythology, Ares got a makeover as Mars. More disciplined, more honorable, less sweaty. But in Greece, he stayed the chaotic, muscle-bound avatar of violence. Still, Ares had his moments. In times of actual war, he was feared and revered. Warriors made sacrifices to him, hoping he'd bring them strength, or at least ignore them for a while. And when he wasn't breaking things, he did ride a cool chariot pulled by fire-breathing horses, which earns him at least one style point. Aphrodite was the goddess of love, beauty, desire, and romantic messes with extremely high body counts. If you've ever seen someone fall in love way too fast with exactly the wrong person, congratulations, you've witnessed Aphrodite's divine influence. There are two origin stories for her, depending on how much trauma you can stomach. In one version, she's the daughter of Zeus and Dion. In the older and frankly much weirder version, she's born from the sea foam that formed when Cronus chopped off Uranus's godly equipment and tossed it into the ocean. And yes, that's probably the least romantic origin ever assigned to the goddess of romance. Aphrodite was so stunningly beautiful that mortals and gods alike basically lost their ability to make good decisions in her presence. She had an actual magical belt, the cestus, that made her irresistible to anyone, which, let's be honest, is a mildly unfair advantage in the love department. Despite being the embodiment of desire, Aphrodite's own love life was complicated. She was married to Hephaestus, a hard-working god of fire and blacksmithing, but she famously preferred the company of Ares, the god of war, which tells you everything you need to know about her taste in men. Their affair was exposed when Hephaestus trapped them mid-romance in a golden net and summoned the other gods to come take a look. Ancient Greece, where revenge and group humiliation were considered excellent conflict resolution. But Aphrodite wasn't all chaos and cheating. She had a softer side too. She helped young lovers, presided over weddings, and brought beauty to the world. She was the goddess people prayed to before confessing a crush or trying to charm their way out of something stupid. Still, she wasn't above starting wars. She's the one who offered Helen of Troy to Paris, sparking the Trojan War. Why? because she wanted to win a divine beauty contest. Yes, really. An entire civilization burned because Aphrodite wanted a golden apple that said to the fairest, "She's the patron goddess of desire, not stability. Beautiful, intoxicating, and absolutely not interested in your relationship boundaries." Hephaestus was the god of fire, metalworking, craftsmanship, and being the only Olympian who actually had a job. While the rest of the gods were busy starting wars, chasing mortals, or throwing lightning like confetti, Hephaestus was in the workshop, forging weapons, building palaces, and muttering under his breath. His origin story varies, but none of it is flattering. In one version, he's born deformed, and Hera, repulsed by his appearance, tosses him off Mount Olympus like unwanted luggage. In another, Zeus does the tossing after a family argument. Either way, the man falls from heaven, lands hard, and ends up with a permanent limp and probably some abandonment issues the size of Crete. Despite the rocky start, Hephaestus gets back to Olympus. Not through forgiveness, but through leverage. He crafts Hera a magical golden throne, which, surprise, traps her. The gods beg him to return and free her. He agrees, but only if they let him back into the divine club. Negotiation nailed. Now, back in Olympus, Hephaestus becomes the divine handyman. He forges Zeus's thunderbolts, Poseidon's trident, Achilles' armor, and pretty much every magical item anyone brags about. If it glows, flies, or explodes, Hephaestus probably made it while working unpaid overtime. And yet, for all his brilliance, he was consistently disrespected. His wife, Aphrodite, assigned, not chosen, famously cheated on him with Ares. His family, emotionally distant, to put it kindly. His co-workers, constantly breaking the stuff he just fixed. But Hephaestus never lashed out like Ares or schemed like Hera. His revenge was creative, elegant, passive-aggressive even. That net he used to catch Aphrodite in Ares' mid-affair, artisan crafted and designed for maximum public humiliation, practical and poetic. He's not glamorous, he doesn't sparkle, but he's the god who built Olympus. Literally, Hephaestus is the unsung hero, the working-class deity of the gods, the patron of blacksmiths, artisans, inventors, and anyone who's ever screamed at a malfunctioning machine and then fixed it with duct tape and rage. Hermes is the god of travelers, commerce, thieves, messaging, and suspiciously fast-talking. He's the guy with winged sandals, a staff that probably came with no user manual, and an energy that screams, "I've already eaten 3 olives and lied twice today." Unlike most gods, Hermes hit the ground running literally. On the day of his birth, he crawled out of his crib, stole Apollo's cattle, invented the lyre using a tortoiseshell, and then returned to his cradle before anyone noticed. That's day one. Most gods take centuries to cause that much chaos. Hermes needed about 6 hours. He's known as the messenger of the gods, but that's underselling it. He didn't just deliver messages, he smuggled souls into the underworld, guided heroes through enemy territory, and probably invented the divine version of express shipping. If there was trouble, Hermes was already 2 steps ahead of it, leaving behind a suspiciously vague alibi and a charming grin. He also served as the god of commerce and trade, because nothing says trustworthy marketplace energy like the same guy who oversees thievery. Hermes represented negotiation, persuasion, and morally flexible entrepreneurship. Basically the patron st. of salesmen, travelers, pickpockets, and anyone who's ever bartered at a flea market. But he wasn't just a charming rogue. Hermes was loyal when it counted. He helped Odysseus outsmart Circe. He gave Perseus the tools to behead Medusa. He even guided souls to the underworld with surprising tenderness, proving that beneath all that mischief, he had a job he took seriously. Hermes also had a signature accessory, caduceus, a winged staff with 2 intertwined snakes. It's often confused with a symbol of medicine, which is ironic, considering Hermes' primary qualifications were speed, lying, and professional boundary hopping. If Olympus had an IT department, Hermes would be the overcaffeinated tech guy who speaks in acronyms, solves your problems in 2 minutes, and then disappears to go optimize cloud functions, which may or may not involve stealing Zeus's wallet. He's clever, quick, unreliable, and deeply lovable. The god of getting things done, getting away with it, and not answering follow-up questions. Demeter is the goddess of the harvest, agriculture, and grain. and giving life to the world, provided she's in a mood. When Demeter is happy, crops flourish, trees bear fruit, and the world blooms with abundance. When she's upset, well, say hello to winter famine and general withering disappointment. She's one of the quieter Olympians, doesn't throw thunderbolts, doesn't start wars, doesn't turn people into animals. But don't mistake quiet for harmless. She can shut down the planet's food supply with one bad move, which, as it turns out, she did. Enter Persephone, beloved daughter, the literal flower child of Olympus. One day, Persephone is out picking flowers, minding her own mythological business, when the earth opens up and Hades, god of the underworld and professional kidnapper, swoops in and abducts her. Classic Greek parenting crisis. Demeter, understandably, loses her divine mind. She searches the earth in grief, refusing to let anything grow until her daughter is returned. Crops fail. Animals starve. Mortals beg for mercy. Demeter's response? No Persephone, no product. Eventually, Zeus intervenes, mostly because the humans are dying and no one's getting any sacrifices. A deal is struck. Persephone will spend part of the year with Hades, part with Demeter, and thus, the seasons are born. Spring and summer. Demeter's happy. Fall and winter. She's pouting. So yes, one of the most important natural cycles in human existence comes from Demeter's seasonal mood swings. Global agriculture, powered by maternal grief and emotional blackmail. Mythology at its finest. Demeter also had a strong sense of justice. She once taught humans how to grow wheat and build civilizations, then turn around and burn a royal baby because the parents interrupted her mid-ritual. It's a fine line between goddess of life and terrifying earth witch. But at her core, Demeter represents nurture, resilience, and the sacred bond between mother and child. She brings life from the ground and takes it away just as easily. Dionysus is the god of wine, revelry, fertility, theater, madness, and those questionable decisions you make after your third glass of whatever he's pouring. He's the divine embodiment of YOLO, wrapped in ivy, slightly intoxicated, and possibly summoning a panther. Born under very dramatic circumstances, Dionysus started life as the child of Zeus and a mortal woman, Semele. When Hera found out, because of course she did, she tricked Semele into asking Zeus to reveal his true, godly form. Spoiler. It vaporized her. Zeus, ever the problem solver, stitched the unborn Dionysus into his thigh and carried him to term. Yes, thigh pregnancy, Greek mythology, where nothing is weird enough to question. Dionysus grew up wandering the earth, spreading wine-making, chaotic joy, and mild existential dread. He was followed by a rowdy entourage of satyrs, maenads, and woodland party crashers, a traveling circus of ecstasy, and potential property damage. His worship wasn't just about fun and grapes. Dionysian rituals involved letting go of your identity, your inhibitions, and sometimes your clothes. His festivals were wild, immersive, and often involved masks, theater, and very questionable decisions under the stars. Think Burning Man, but with divine consequences. But Dionysus wasn't all fun and fermented joy. He had a temper, a very theatrical one. If you mocked him, refused his worship, or interrupted his vibe, things got weird. One king who banned his cult was driven mad and dismembered by his own people. Another was turned into a dolphin. He didn't do light punishment. He did statement punishments. Yet he was also deeply compassionate, especially to outcasts, misfits, and those outside polite society. He gave comfort to the broken, voice to the silenced, and occasionally transformed people into vines, which is probably symbolic of something. Dionysus is the paradox of divine liberation and chaos. He's joy and destruction, art and madness, the god who blesses you with creativity one moment and has you dancing barefoot in a vineyard the next, questioning your life choices. Artemis is the goddess of the hunt, wilderness, wild animals, and the moon. She's also the goddess of no, I will not explain myself. And yes, that was a threat. Often depicted with a bow in one hand and zero tolerance in the other, Artemis is one of the few Olympians who didn't need thunderbolts or love potions. She had precision, discipline, and a pack of divine wolves. Twin sister to Apollo, Artemis arrived in this world in typical overachiever fashion. She helped deliver her own brother shortly after her own birth. From that moment forward, she was done with men. She swore off marriage, romance, and anything remotely resembling emotional vulnerability. Instead, she roamed forests, hunted stags, and surrounded herself with a loyal band of maiden followers who all shared her love for nature and disinterest in drama. Artemis is best known for her purity, not in a Victorian fainting couch way, but more in the touch me and I turn you into a deer way. Take Actaeon, for instance, a hunter who accidentally stumbled upon her bathing. Rather than calmly explain boundaries, she transformed him into a stag and let his own dogs tear him apart. Message received. She was fiercely protective, especially of women and children. While many Olympian gods treated mortals like chess pieces or dating apps, Artemis acted as a divine shield for the vulnerable. She punished those who disrespected sacred nature or harmed the innocent, and her vengeance was swift, poetic, and usually fatal. As a moon goddess, she represented calm, clarity, and mystery. She brought light to the night and guided travelers through darkness, metaphorically and literally. If Apollo was the sun's blinding brilliance, Artemis was the moon's cold, focused stare. Less warmth, more watchfulness. She wasn't flashy, but she didn't need to be. Artemis had a presence. You didn't challenge her. You didn't flirt with her. You just hoped she wasn't aiming in your direction. In modern terms, Artemis is the original independent woman, fierce, free, and entirely uninterested in what you think of her. She didn't live in Olympus. She ran in the woods. Apollo is the god of the sun music. Prophecy, healing, poetry, archery, and honestly, at this point, just assume he put his name on every job opening on Mount Olympus. If the gods had LinkedIn, Apollo's profile would crash the site. Twin brother of Artemis, Apollo is the shiny, radiant poster child of Olympus. Golden hair, golden lyre, golden chariot. He's the reason we have daylight, according to Greek myth, as he literally drove the sun across the sky every day in a flaming chariot. No pressure if you're running late, but beneath all that brilliance lies a lot of feelings. Apollo is dramatic. He's emotional. He's the guy who sings ballads after a breakup and then curses the person who rejected him. Literally. Ask Daphne. She turned into a tree just to get away from him. Apollo mourned her loss, then turned her into a sacred symbol and wore her leaves as a crown, because that's healthy. He's also the god of prophecy, which means he technically knows things will end badly and still gets upset when they do. Classic overachiever energy. He established the Oracle of Delphi, where priestesses, fueled by divine madness, mumbled poetic riddles that somehow explained everyone's destiny. Very user-friendly. Apollo had a complicated relationship with love. He chased several mortals, was rejected by most, and reacted with varying degrees of poetic overkill. When a Spartan prince named Hyacinthus died during a discus game, possibly from Apollo's own poorly thrown disc, he was so distraught he turned the boy into a flower, which is sweet if you ignore the blunt force trauma part. Despite all this, Apollo was also a healer. His son, Asclepius, became the god of medicine, and Apollo himself could cure plagues or cause them, depending on how offended he felt that day. In short, Apollo was brilliance wrapped in insecurity, power dressed in poetry, and charm with a short fuse. The kind of god who'd write you a love song and then shoot you with an arrow if you didn't clap. Hestia is the goddess of the hearth, home, and domestic peace, which is ancient Greek for the only Olympian who didn't cause weak international incidents. She was the eldest child of Cronus and Rhea, and also the first to be swallowed whole by her charmingly paranoid father. Later, she was the last to be vomited back up when Zeus overthrew him, which means technically she's both the oldest and youngest Olympian. Yes, Greek mythology is a funhouse mirror of logic, unlike her more chaotic siblings. Hestia chose peace. She didn't participate in power struggles, didn't throw curses, didn't sleep with mortals, and didn't even throw shade. She was offered a throne on Olympus, shrugged politely, and gave it up to Dionysus. Why? So she could tend the eternal flame and not get dragged into family drama. Queen behavior. She presided over the hearth, the center of every home, temple, and city. Wherever there was a flame burning for warmth, food, or ritual, Hestia was there in spirit. No temples in her name, no scandalous myths, just a quiet presence that made everything else work. The original background is essential. She was also the goddess of hospitality. In a world where shelter and food meant survival, she represented the sacred duty of caring for guests. Invoking her meant your fire would stay lit, your bread wouldn't burn, and hopefully your relatives would leave on time. And unlike most Olympians, she didn't go around turning people into animals, inanimate objects, or ironic morality lessons. Hestia didn't need revenge. She had a well-swept floor and inner peace. Because of her, every meal began and ended with an offering. Every city had her flame burning in its heart. And every prayer circle probably had someone whispering, "Thank you for not being a handful." If the gods were a dysfunctional office, Zeus would be the CEO with boundary issues, Athena the overqualified strategist, Dionysus the HR violation, and Hestia would be the calm office manager, keeping the coffee warm and the lights on, while everyone else argued about whose temple caught fire. Hestia reminds us that there's power in stillness, value in simplicity, and sometimes the most essential figure is the one who doesn't demand attention but holds everything together. Persephone is one of the most fascinating figures in Greek mythology, a goddess with a split personality written directly into the seasons. She's the bloom of spring and the chill of death, life and decay, flower crown and iron throne. She's the daughter of Demeter, goddess of the harvest, which already puts her in the realm of life and fertility. But then things took a turn, as they often do in Greek myth. When Hades, lord of the underworld, saw her picking flowers and decided on wife material, he abducted her straight into the underworld. No discussion, no coffee first. Demeter, naturally, was devastated. She scoured the earth, and when no one told her where Persephone had gone, she shut down agriculture entirely. The result? Global famine and an angry mob of hungry mortals. Eventually, Zeus intervened, not out of fatherly concern, but because no one was sacrificing anything while starving. A compromise was reached. Persephone could return if she hadn't eaten anything in the underworld, which, of course, she had 6 pomegranate seeds, just enough to legally bind her to a part-time gig in the land of the dead. Thus began her dual role. Half the year on Earth with Demeter, ushering in spring and summer, the other half with Hades in the underworld, giving us fall and winter. The ancient Greeks invented seasonal depression with a myth. But here's where things get interesting. Over time, Persephone embraced her role as queen of the dead. She wasn't just a sad, kidnapped flower girl. She became a ruler. Calm, firm, and quietly powerful, mortals prayed to her for mercy, for safe passage, for understanding the balance between life and death. She represents transformation, not just seasonal, but emotional. The shift from innocence to strength, from being taken to taking control. Persephone is the goddess of duality. She walks through flowers and bones with equal grace. She's the reason flowers bloom, and the reason they will. Before Psyche was even old enough to understand the word goddess, she was being compared to one. By the time she reached womanhood, statues of Aphrodite were gathering dust, while mortals traveled miles just to glimpse the face of this mortal girl. Her beauty wasn't simply admired, it was worshipped. Entire crowds treated her as if she were Aphrodite, reincarnated in flesh and bone. People whispered that she must be divine, that no mortal woman could look like this by accident. But for Psyche, all the reverence felt hollow. She walked through cities and villages like a phantom, adored but untouched, celebrated but alone. No one dared to approach her with true affection. Men looked at her like a living painting, flawless, silent, untouchable. Even her family, though proud, grew uneasy. Her 2 sisters had married noble men, begun families, and lived the kind of grounded, warm lives that Psyche herself craved. But no suitor would dare to court a girl believed to be a rival of Aphrodite, and therein lay the danger. You see, the gods weren't fond of competition, especially Aphrodite. Watching her temples grow silent while mortals laid garlands at the feet of a mere girl made the goddess burn with divine rage. To her, Psyche wasn't a beautiful child. She was an insult carved into flesh. Yet Psyche knew none of this. She spent her days walking gardens alone, speaking to no one. She never felt a lover's touch or heard a whispered vow in the dark. Her beauty had become a curse, one that distanced her from the only thing she truly wanted, a soul that saw her, not just her face. She would stand by her window at dusk, watching the horizon fade and thinking perhaps this was her fate, to be loved by all, but held by none. No priest, no oracle, no stranger ever offered an answer until one day someone did. But it wasn't a man. It wasn't a priest. And it wasn't a mortal. It was a goddess. And she wasn't offering love. She was demanding revenge on Mount Olympus. Beauty was more than vanity. It was power. And no one wielded it like Aphrodite. She was the goddess of desire, of seduction, of divine charm. But lately, her temples echoed with emptiness. Her statue stood lonely beneath the sun. Why? Because mortals now knelt before a human girl, Psyche, as if she were the new goddess of love. To Aphrodite, this wasn't just offensive. It was treason. The goddess watched from her celestial perch, her envy twisting into hatred. She had destroyed kings for less. How dare a mortal girl steal her worshippers? How dare she exist as a living insult to divine beauty? And so Aphrodite did what goddesses do. She summoned her son, Eros. Now, Eros wasn't just any deity. He was the god of love, yes, but not the soft, tender love mortals wrote poems about. No, Eros dealt in chaos. He sparked passion where there should be none. He made kings fall for swindlers, queens for slaves, enemies for each other. His arrows didn't ask for permission. They shattered logic, loyalty, and sometimes entire empires. Aphrodite's command was simple. Make Psyche fall in love with the most hideous, vile creature on earth. Something monstrous. Something beneath even the worms. Let her feel what it's like to be mocked by love. Eros, ever the obedient son, accepted. Bow slung over his back, quiver full of divine arrows. He descended to the mortal realm under the cover of moonlight. He found Psyche asleep in her chamber, candlelight flickering across her features like water. She was beautiful. Too beautiful. And Eros, who had pierced 1,000 hearts, felt his own skip a beat. This wasn't right. This wasn't part of the plan. Still, he reached for his arrow. But in his distraction, something went wrong. His hand slipped. The arrow pricked his skin. Just a drop. But it was enough. The god of love had just fallen victim to his own power. And in that moment, fate shifted, for Eros would no longer be his mother's weapon. He would be Psyche's silent protector, but neither of them knew what price the gods would demand for this forbidden affection. And Aphrodite would not forgive betrayal. Eros vanished before Psyche could stir from her sleep, the wound from his own arrow still warm on his skin. He had pierced countless hearts, but never once had he fallen prey to his own game. Now, with every beat of his heart, he felt a longing he didn't understand. A need to protect her, to cherish her, to hide her from the cruel eyes of Olympus. But protection came with sacrifice. He couldn't tell her the truth. If Aphrodite discovered he had disobeyed her, worse, that he had fallen in love, there would be no mercy. Not for him. Not for Psyche. So Eros made a quiet vow. He would love her from the shadows. Meanwhile, Psyche's life grew stranger by the day. No suitors came. Her beauty, once a spectacle, now seemed cursed. Whispers of divine punishment swirled through the kingdom. Her father, desperate and afraid, consulted the oracle of Apollo, and the words returned were cruel. She shall not wed a mortal man. Instead, she will marry a monster, a beast feared even by the gods. Send her to the mountaintop, dressed as a bride. There her fate awaits. Her family wept. Her sisters gasped, but Psyche stood still, silent, as if the wind had carved her into stone. A monster. This was her destiny. Not love, not choice, but sacrifice. Still, she agreed. Not out of courage, but out of resignation. She had been adored like a goddess, yet never touched by love. Perhaps this cruel, monstrous fate, it was simply balanced. Eros watched from above, his heart twisting with guilt. He had meant to protect her, But now the gods had spun a web he couldn't untangle. If he intervened openly, his mother would know. But if he did nothing, Psyche would be lost. So he devised a plan. He would take her to a secret place, a hidden palace known only to him, cloaked in illusion and silence. He would love her, not as a god, but as a shadow. He would never show his face, never speak his name. And above all, he would never tell her the truth. Because if she knew who he was, who she was truly with, everything would shatter. Even the god of love was afraid of heartbreak. The wind was soft but strong as it carried Psyche away from the mountain peak. She had expected cold rock and gnashing teeth. She had braced for a monster's roar. But instead, silence. Gentle, surreal silence. When she opened her eyes, she was no longer on the mountain. She stood in a meadow of glowing flowers, more radiant than any garden she had ever known. A path of polished stone wound through the field, leading to something impossible. A palace grander than anything human hands could build. Its pillars shimmered like moonlight on water. Its halls whispered her name without sound. Psyche stepped through the threshold, expecting fear but finding peace. Servants she couldn't see guided her hands, washed her feet, placed robes upon her shoulders. Food appeared warm and fragrant, though no one set the table at night. A voice deep, tender, and kind spoke from the shadows. Do not be afraid. You are safe. This is your home. It was him, her unseen husband, the one the oracle had promised. But there was no snarling beast, no monstrous form, just a voice. And strangely, it didn't frighten her. He never revealed himself, not even in darkness each night. He joined her in the quiet velvet of the bedchamber. He touched her face like a dream. He whispered laughter in her ear, and each morning he was gone before the sun rose. She was falling fast, love without sight, intimacy without form. Each word he spoke made her ache for more. But the one thing he always begged was this: never try to see me. She asked once gently. Why? The voice tensed. If you see me, I must leave you forever. And so she obeyed. But the mystery grew heavier with each passing day. How could such a kind, thoughtful man be the monster the oracle warned of? Why must love hide its face? And why, when she whispered her name, did he never whisper his? Psyche told herself it didn't matter, that she didn't need to know. But the human heart is a curious thing. And the seeds of doubt, once planted, never stay buried for long, especially when family comes to visit, and especially when sisters come bearing poison disguised as love. It had been weeks, perhaps months. Time moved strangely in the invisible palace. Psyche knew peace, laughter, luxury, and love. But she also knew isolation. No faces, no names, no truth. Just a voice in the dark and shadows that kissed her lips. Then, one morning, her husband's voice was different. Sorrow will follow if you see them, he said. See who? Your sisters. They believe they come out of love, but what they bring is ruin. Psyche's heart cracked. She missed them. Their teasing, their warmth, even their jealousy. They were her last connection to the mortal world. To the girl she used to be before gods and palaces and mystery husbands, she pleaded. Let me see them, please, just once. Eros hesitated, but he could never deny her. He agreed with one warning. Do not let their words poison what we have. They will try to unravel your trust. You must not listen. And so the winds that once lifted Psyche carried her sisters to the garden gates of the invisible palace. When they saw her, they were stunned. She was alive, more than alive, radiant, draped in silks, finer than any queen, her skin glowing like starlight. They embraced her, laughing nervously, hiding their envy beneath brittle smiles. Where is your husband? One asked. Psyche smiled. He comes only at night. I've never seen him. The sisters froze. You've never seen him? She nodded. He won't let you see his face. The other gasped. What if he's hideous? A beast or worse? What if he's one of the gods using you and laughing behind her back? Their voices dripped with sweet concern, but Psyche felt the change. The old sibling rivalry was still there, now twisted into something darker. Jealousy sharpened their words. He keeps you hidden, blind, dependent. Is that love or imprisonment? The seed of doubt was planted. They saw it take root and they smiled. As they left, they kissed her cheeks and whispered, "Just take a lamp one night. See for yourself. If he loves you, what harm can truth do?" Psyche watched them disappear into the wind, and for the first time since arriving in paradise, she couldn't stop shaking. Not from fear. Out of curiosity that night, Psyche couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark, wrapped in silk sheets, his arms gently curled around her, his breath steady beside hers. But her mind was loud, louder than his heart, louder than love. Her sister's words kept repeating like a spell. What if he's a monster? What if he's using you? What if he's not who you think he is? She had trusted blindly. She had given herself completely to a voice in the dark. But was that love or simply surrender? She slipped from the bed, silent as snowfall. Her bare feet kissed the cold floor, and in her hand she held a small bronze oil lamp, its wick already lit. Her heart thundered in her chest as she approached. Her fingers trembled as she leaned in, and when the light reached his face, she gasped. Not a monster, not a god in disguise. A man beautiful beyond words. Golden curls tangled on the pillow, soft lips curved in sleep, and on his back, wings feathered, divine, folded like a secret. This was Eros, the god of love, and he had chosen her. Her eyes filled with tears, not from fear, but from guilt. He had trusted her, warned her, loved her, and she had doubts. She leaned closer, wanting to kiss his lips, to whisper an apology before the light was gone. But fate is cruel. A single drop of hot oil spilled from the lamp and touched his bare shoulder. He awoke with a cry of pain and betrayal. His wings flared open, his eyes wide with heartbreak. "You broke your promise," he said, voice hollow. "You trusted fear more than love." "I'm sorry," Psyche whispered, falling to her knees. "I just wanted to know." Eros stepped back, his glow dimming. "Now you do." And with that, he vanished into the darkness. The palace crumbled behind him. The invisible world they'd shared unraveled like smoke. Psyche was left alone on a barren hillside, the lamp still warm in her hand and her heart shattered. She had seen the god of love, and lost him, not to fate, but to doubt. Psyche wandered, barefoot and broken, across a world that suddenly seemed colder. The lush gardens, the silken halls, the voice that once lulled her to sleep, gone. The sky offered no answer. The earth gave no comfort. Only her regret remained. Each step was heavy with sorrow. She called out to Eros in forests, in fields, in rivers, even in dreams. But there was no reply. The god of love had vanished, not from Olympus, but from her life. In desperation, Psyche returned to her father's home. But the palace that once cherished her now whispered with rumors. Her sisters, triumphant in her misery, claimed she had married a demon and lost everything. No one believed her tale of love and gods and winged husbands, so she left again. This time, not out of exile, but purpose. She would find Eros, no matter how far she had to go, no matter what wrath she might face, even if it meant entering Olympus itself. But mortals don't simply walk into the heavens. So she sought the only one who might guide her path, the one who had started it all. Aphrodite. Yes, Psyche was afraid. The goddess had reason to hate her. But if Eros still loved her, if there was even a sliver of hope, then Psyche would face even the wrath of Olympus to earn redemption. She found Aphrodite not in a golden temple, but in a private garden surrounded by mirrors. The goddess looked into her own reflection, as if searching for flaws that didn't exist. When Psyche approached, Aphrodite didn't turn. "I warned you once," the goddess said coldly, "and still you touched what was mine." Psyche knelt. "I love him." Aphrodite laughed. "You love him? You mean the son you betrayed? The god you doubted?" "I was foolish," Psyche admitted, "but I will do anything to earn back his trust." Aphrodite turned, her eyes sharp as blades. "Anything?" Psyche nodded. The goddess smiled, but it was not kind. Then you will suffer. You will be tested, and perhaps at the end of your agony, you'll be worthy of my son. Thus began a trial not of strength, but a devotion, and Psyche would have to face it alone. Aphrodite didn't waste time. Her beauty was legendary, but her cruelty, when provoked, was equally divine. If Psyche wanted even a chance to see Eros again, she would have to prove her worth through a series of impossible trials. The first task was deceptively simple. Aphrodite led her to a vast storage chamber where mountains of seeds spilled across the floor. Barley, millet, lentils, poppy, wheat, and beans all mixed together into an indistinguishable chaos. By nightfall, Aphrodite said with a yawn, "Separate them, every grain, every seed, into its proper pile. If you fail, you'll never see my son again." Then she left, humming to herself. Psyche stared at the impossible task. Even 1,000 hands wouldn't be enough to sort such a mess in a day. She knelt anyway and began picking seed after seed, her fingers shaking. Minutes passed like hours, her eyes blurred. She wasn't even a fraction of the way through. But the gods are always watching, and so are their creatures, unseen by Psyche. A line of ants had been watching her toil. Not just any ants. These were sacred to Demeter, goddess of the harvest. Perhaps they pitied the girl. Perhaps they were moved by love. In a sudden flurry of motion, hundreds of tiny legs raced across the floor. The ants formed living rivers, dividing the seeds with shocking precision. In minutes, the chaos became orderly. Barley to one side, lentils to another. Millet in neat pyramids. It was like watching nature itself rewrite the laws of time. When Aphrodite returned at dusk, she was met not with failure, but perfection. She narrowed her eyes. "You had help," she snapped. Psyche bowed her head. "I only did what I could." Aphrodite's lips twitched with something between anger and amusement. She hadn't expected the mortal girl to complete the task, much less with grace, but no matter. There were still many more trials to go. Harder ones, deadlier ones. This was only the beginning, the goddess warned. If you want to see Eros again, you'll need more than luck. And yet Psyche, exhausted, sore but standing, nodded. "I'll do whatever it takes because love, true love, was worth more than divine comfort or mortal pride." And Psyche's war had only just begun. Psyche barely had time to rest before Aphrodite handed her the second task. This one even crueler in its design. "See that river down there?" the goddess asked, pointing to a winding stream glinting beneath the afternoon sun. "It runs beside a meadow where wild rams graze. Their wool is made of gold. Bring me a tuft of it, just a handful, but do try not to die." She smirked and vanished, leaving Psyche to face what she knew was more than a simple chore. These were no gentle creatures. The golden rams were sacred, their eyes wild and their horns sharp as spears. They were known to gore anything that entered their field, tearing intruders apart without warning. They glittered like treasure, but guarded it with rage. Still, Psyche climbed down the hill and approached the field. She crouched by the reeds, heart pounding, watching the creatures roam. Their hooves cracked against stones, their growls echoed low and primal. There was no way she could survive entering their territory in daylight. She sank to her knees, tears welling, fear clawing at her resolve. But once again, the world watched. A quiet whisper drifted through the tall grass, a soft voice. Like reeds swaying in rhythm, it was a spirit of the river, an old presence bound to the stream. "Do not enter the field while the sun is high," the spirit murmured. "The rams rage under daylight, but when twilight falls, they rest in the shade. Wait, and then gather the wool from the thorny branches where it has snagged. No beast will miss it." Hope returned. Psyche waited. Hours passed. The golden rams, one by one, wandered into the trees and settled into slumber. As darkness fell, she crept forward, quiet, careful, and found tufts of golden fleece tangled in brambles and bark. By moonlight, she gathered the wool and returned to Aphrodite, who narrowed her eyes at the shimmering handful in Psyche's palm. "You live again," the goddess muttered, curious. But Psyche said nothing. No pride, no gloating, just silent strength. Because love had taught her something even the god had forgotten. Courage grows quiet, but it endures. And though Aphrodite was not finished testing her, Psyche was far from finished fighting. Aphrodite was growing frustrated. Psyche had survived tasks meant to crush her, using nothing but determination and a strange mind. Unshakable luck. The goddess's smile was gone now, replaced by cold calculation. And so, for the third trial, she gave Psyche an errand that should have ended her story for good. "Fetch me water," she said. "Not from a well, not from a stream, but from the river Styx itself." Psyche paled. The Styx was no ordinary river. It marked the boundary between the world of the living and the dead. Its waters were sacred, cursed, and fatal to touch. Even the gods approached it with fear. Mortals didn't survive its banks. They didn't even return. Still, Psyche nodded. Her journey led her to the edge of a cliff so steep it seemed carved by the hands of titans. Far below, the river Styx churned like black glass, and from it rose vaporous curses and cries of lost souls. Its current didn't flow. It coiled like a living serpent. Worse still, guarding the river were monstrous winged beings, centuries of the underworld. They swooped and screamed at anything that moved, claws sharp enough to tear bone from flesh. There was no way down, no path forward, no hope. She collapsed beneath a rock ledge, clutching the crystal vial Aphrodite had mockingly handed her. "Just a sip," the goddess had said. "Enough to show you tried." But then a shimmer. A high-pitched hum filled the air, and from a crack in the stone emerged a tiny creature, an eagle, massive by bird standards, regal and golden-eyed, sent by Zeus himself, the eagle of thunder and kings without a word. It took the vial from Psyche's hand, spread its wings, and soared down the deadly cliff. The sentries shrieked, but dared not attack, for even death respected Zeus's command. Within moments, the eagle returned, placing the sealed vial filled with Styx's shimmering, cursed waters into Psyche's trembling hands. She didn't ask why Zeus helped her. Perhaps Eros had once helped him. Perhaps even gods respect for love's endurance. When Psyche returned to Aphrodite, the goddess accepted the vial with stony silence. Psyche had passed again, but the final trial would take her where even gods fear to go, and not all love stories survive a journey into the underworld. Aphrodite's voice was colder than the Styx itself. "For your final task," she said, "you will journey to the realm of Hades there. You will beg Queen Persephone for a box of her beauty. A gift, you see, for me. I'm feeling quite worn lately. Your existence exhausts me." It was a death sentence. Even the boldest mortals avoided the underworld. The living did not enter Hades' realm and return, but Psyche no longer hesitated. If the path to Eros lay through darkness, then darkness would not stop her, guided by whispers from sympathetic voices. Some say Demeter, others say invisible demons of kindness. She found a hidden entrance, a cave that pierced the world's surface like a forgotten scar. She brought with her 2 coins for Charon, the ferryman, and barley cakes for Cerberus, the 3-headed hound. Every step deeper drained the warmth from her bones. The air was thick, not with smoke, but silence. The souls she passed drifted like memories. Thin, hollow, and unreachable at the river Acheron, Charon accepted her payment and rode her through still waters stained with forgotten grief. When Cerberus appeared, snarling at the threshold of Persephone's palace, she fed him the cakes. He quieted, licking his blood-stained jaws. Inside, Persephone sat serene on her obsidian throne, eyes like polished garnets. "You come for beauty," the queen said, not unkindly. "But at what cost?" "I do not want it for myself," Psyche replied. "I must deliver it to Aphrodite." Persephone nodded. Perhaps she too understood the madness of love. She handed Psyche a small sealed box, plain, unmarked, and yet unbearably heavy. "Do not open it," the queen warned. "It is not meant for your eyes." Psyche thanked her and turned to leave. The journey back was quiet, but heavier now, with temptation. The box pulsed in her hands. Surely just a peek couldn't hurt, she told herself. No, over and over. But doubt, like before, crept in. What if this beauty made her worthy of Eros again? What if this was the final key? The surface was near. Her heart raced, her fingers twitched, and as light returned to her face for the first time in days, she opened the box. And darkness consumed her. The moment Psyche opened the box, expecting light and beauty, a cold mist spilled from it like a breath from the grave. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't divine radiance. I slept. Not ordinary sleep, but the deathless slumber of the underworld, crafted by Persephone to preserve her power, not to beautify Aphrodite. Psyche didn't scream. She didn't collapse. She simply dropped. Her body fell softly onto the grass at the edge of the mortal world, the sealed box beside her, her limbs frozen, her breath silenced. She wasn't dead, but neither was she alive, caught in an eternal pause, her heart stilled by her own curiosity. And that might have been the end of Psyche, but love has a way of surviving, even death. Far away in Olympus, Eros had not forgotten her. His wounds had healed, but his heart had not. He had kept away at his mother's command, tormented by visions of Psyche toiling through impossible trials. And when he heard she had entered the underworld, he knew she had done it for him, defying Aphrodite, braving death, all for love. That was no mortal girl. That was a queen. Eros defied his mother. Bursting from Olympus in a blaze of wings and gold, he raced through the skies, the clouds splitting at his heels, until he found her motionless, silent, lying like a marble statue kissed by the dusk. He fell to his knees beside her, and he wept. Not tears of sorrow, but of rage, of regret, of love too big for words. He lifted the box gently and sealed it shut. Then, without hesitation, he leaned down and kissed her lips. Not a magical kiss, not a spell. Just a kiss. A promise, a memory, a plea. And her eyes fluttered open. Psyche gasped, the sleep lifting like fog. Her hands reached for him before she could even speak. Eros, she breathed. You came back, he whispered. I never stopped loving you. He held her tighter than ever before, and in that moment, all the gods who had watched, some amused, some angered, finally understood. Even the god of love had met his match. Their reunion shook Olympus. Eros, the god of love, had defied his mother. Psyche, a mortal, had defied death, and together they had crossed the boundaries between divine and human, between duty and desire. Such love was dangerous. Aphrodite was livid. She stormed into the court of the gods, demanding punishment. This mortal, she cried, has mocked the gods, meddled with sacred laws, and corrupted my son. She must be erased. But the gods were no longer so certain. They had seen Psyche's trials, witnessed her suffer, persevere, and rise again. Her love had survived what no mortal love ever had. Still, the matter had to be decided, and so they turned to Zeus. The king of the gods sat silent on his throne, lightning in one hand, fate in the other. He had watched all of it, from Psyche's fall to her rise, from her doubt to her devotion. At last he spoke. There is power, Zeus said, in a love that endures. Aphrodite opened her mouth to protest, but he raised a hand. You have tested her. She is past more than any mortal I have ever seen. She is not unworthy of Olympus. She is proof that even mortals can love like gods. Then he turned to Eros and Psyche. You want to be together, truly, forever? They both nodded. Then so be it. With a flick of his hand, Zeus summoned a goblet filled with ambrosia, the drink of the gods. He offered it to Psyche. Drink, and you will no longer be mortal. Your heart will beat with eternity. Your soul will live among us. But your trials will not be erased. You will carry them as we all carry the stories that shape us. Psyche took the goblet. Her hands didn't tremble. She drank. Warmth spread through her, not burning, but blooming. Her senses expanded. Her heartbeat slowed, then deepened like a bell tolling across centuries. And just like that, she was divine, no longer mortal, no longer less. Eros took her hand, and in front of all Olympus they were declared husband and wife. Love, for once, had not ended in tragedy. It had been crowned. The moment Psyche drank the ambrosia, the transformation was complete, not just in body, but in spirit. Her skin shimmered with divine radiance, her eyes now holding galaxies rather than tears. The gods who once scoffed at her mortal blood now watched in awe for the first time in Olympus's long memory. A mortal had earned her place among them, not by bloodline, but by devotion. She was no longer Psyche the girl or Psyche the beautiful. She was now Psyche the immortal, a goddess in her own right. Even Aphrodite, who had once cursed her, could no longer deny what stood before her, a woman who had faced death, temptation, betrayal, and isolation, and still chosen love over pride. Still, the goddess of love wasn't quick to forgive, but Eros, ever his mother's son and yet fiercely Psyche's husband, stepped forward. "She is no rival to your beauty, mother," he said gently. "She is something else entirely, a soul that understands love." And in that moment, the tension melted. Not completely, but enough. Aphrodite's silence was her surrender. Zeus proclaimed her goddess of the soul, Psyche, whose very name in Greek meant both soul and breath of life. Her trials had shaped her not into a statue of perfection, but into the embodiment of what love endures. A great feast was held on Olympus. Nectar flowed like rivers, stars danced in celebration, and even the fates smiled at the story they had once woven in whispers. Psyche stood by Eros, no longer uncertain or afraid. She was equal. She was divine. Together they watched the skies above and a mortal world below, guardians of love and the soul's journey. And from their union a daughter was born, hid one, goddess of pleasure and delight, symbol of joy, born from the union of love and soul, where once Psyche had walked among thorns and shadows. She now danced in eternal light, not because she was perfect, but because she had loved, fallen, suffered, and risen again. She was proof that even mortals, even the brokenhearted, could reach the heavens one trial at a time. And so the tale of Eros and Psyche did not end in tragedy, as so many mortal loves do, but in transformation, not into myth, but into something far greater. A truth whispered across centuries, from temples to bedrooms, from storytellers to dreamers. Love, real love, is not easy. It is tested. It is doubted. It is wounded. But when it endures, it becomes eternal. Psyche's journey had begun with beauty, a curse she never asked for. She had been worshipped by strangers, envied by sisters, manipulated by gods. She had been punished for being loved, then punished again for loving back. And yet she never stopped trying. Even when her heart broke, even when her faith cracked, she kept walking. And Eros, the god of love, he learned too. That love is not a weapon, not a game, not a secret in the shadows. It is light, yes, but only if it is faced. Together they taught even Olympus a lesson it had long forgotten. Love does not belong solely to the gods. It belongs to anyone willing to fight for it. In temples across Greece, lovers would offer prayers not just to Aphrodite, but to Psyche. They would whisper her name before marriages, births, and even funerals. Because she wasn't just a goddess, she was a reminder that the soul can survive despair, that love, when it falls, can rise again, and that no matter how deep the underworld, no matter how sharp the trial, the heart knows the way back. Today, long after temples have crumbled and empires have fallen, the story still lives. In the word psyche, meaning soul. In the word psychology, the study of that soul. And in every tale where love is tested and triumphs, Eros and Psyche live on, not as marble statues, but as echoes within all of us. Every time we choose trust over fear, forgiveness over pride, and love over silence, we walk their path. And perhaps, like them, we become a little more divine. Long before she was feared, before statues froze mid-scream and serpents whispered across marble floors, Medusa was a mortal girl, beautiful beyond comparison. Her beauty was not loud or proud. It simply existed, uninvited, like sunlight slipping through stone. Her hair shimmered like strands of midnight silk. Her eyes held a calm of oceans before storms, and her presence, though quiet, unsettled kings and gods alike. She was born into a family of monsters in a time where monsters were worshipped and feared in equal measure. Her sisters, Steno and Euryale, were immortal, fierce and monstrous by design. But Medusa was different. She alone was mortal. She alone could die. and perhaps that made her even more precious. But Medusa wanted no throne, no lovers, no crown of divine favor. She chose something rare. As a young woman, she entered the sacred service of Athena, the virgin goddess of wisdom, war, and restraint. In the echoing marble temple built high on cliffs above the sea, Medusa swept the floors, lit the incense, and whispered prayers long before dawn. She took the vows of chastity, purity, and silence, not because she was forced to, but because she believed. She admired Athena, not just as a goddess, but as an ideal, strong, untouchable, above the chaos of mortal hearts and time. Even the people began to whisper that Medusa was a living statue of Athena herself. Worshippers would sneak glances at her while pretending to pray. Her face became a symbol, her voice rarely heard, her life bound in sacred duty. But beauty, even in a temple, is not safe. Word of Medusa's grace spread beyond the temple walls, past the cities, through forests, into the realm of gods, and with it came danger. For in Olympus, desire often wore a divine face, and the line between admiration and possession was razor thin. One god in particular took notice. Not a god of wisdom, not a god of restraint, but a god of seas, storms, and appetites. And while Medusa kept her vows, fate had already begun to twist, because in the realm of gods, even purity can be punished. And soon, Medusa's sanctuary would become her prison, far beneath the crashing waves and coral palaces of the deep. Poseidon ruled the seas with pride, fury, and a hunger that was never fully satisfied. He had tamed monsters, earth storms, and claimed goddesses, but his eyes now turned to something far less divine. Immortal Medusa. Her beauty had reached even the years of Olympus, but it was her stillness, her discipline, her untouchable grace that obsessed him. She belonged to no man, no god, no mortal king. She had chosen a life of devotion, one that placed her far from desire. And perhaps that was what tempted Poseidon most. The more she prayed, the more he watched. And one evening, when the tide was high and the temple was empty, Poseidon rose from the sea. He did not knock. Gods rarely ask permission. He entered Athena's sacred temple as water pooled beneath his feet, a trail of seawater soaking the marble floor. Medusa, alone and unsuspecting, turned only to find the sea god looming in the shadows, his trident left behind, but his hunger very much present. She called out to Athena, but her cries echoed unanswered. She ran, but temples built for worship were not made for escape. And there, beneath the cold stone gaze of Athena's statue, Poseidon defiled what was sacred. It was not a seduction. It was a violation. When it was over, Poseidon vanished, leaving nothing but salt and silence behind. Medusa, broken, curled beneath her goddess's image, waiting for justice, for comfort, for anything divine. But gods are not always just. When Athena returned to her temple and saw the desecration, her fury was absolute, but not at Poseidon, at Medusa. Whether out of pride, denial, or divine law, Athena blamed her priestess for allowing the temple to be defiled. Whether she saw Medusa as complicit or simply inconvenient didn't matter. The purity of her sanctuary had been broken, and so the goddess of wisdom passed judgment. Not on the god who had violated, but on the mortal who had been violated. Because even in myth, power protects itself. And Medusa, once a symbol of sacred beauty, would now be transformed into a warning no one could ignore. The temple floor was still stained with seawater when Athena returned. The incense had long burned out, the silence was heavy, and at its center Medusa knelt in shame, her head bowed beneath the unblinking gaze of her goddess. But Athena's eyes were not filled with pity. They burned with fury. For her temple, her sanctuary of reason, discipline, and virgin purity had been defiled. And though Poseidon had violated sacred ground, it was Medusa who bore the blame. To Athena, there could be no forgiveness. Gods never apologized, and temples never forgot. The punishment had to be symbolic, eternal. She stepped down from her statue's pedestal and stood over Medusa, who trembled, confused, awaiting mercy from the very goddess she had worshipped for years. But mercy was not given. Instead, Athena's voice echoed like thunder between marble walls. "You have brought shame into my house. Let the world see what becomes a beauty that invites destruction. With a single gesture, she reached down and touched Medusa's forehead. The transformation was immediate. Golden hair turned to writhing serpents, their hissing a cruel mimicry of whispered prayers. Her skin lost its warmth. Her gaze became a weapon. Her eyes, once soft with sorrow, now held a terrible power. Anyone who looked into them would turn to stone. Not enemies, not invaders. Anyone. It was not a punishment for protection. It was isolation, a curse disguised as defense. Medusa cried out, her voice no longer human, her tears, once salt water, now dried before falling. Her breath became still, her reflection shattered mirrors. And worst of all, she could no longer look at another soul without destroying it. Athena did not weep. She did not turn away. She simply watched as her priestess, once beautiful and devout, became something else entirely, a monster. The temple doors closed behind Medusa as she fled into exile, her cries echoing through the hills. No home, no temple, no sisters, no prayers, just stone trails in her wake. And from the cliffs of Olympus, Athena returned to her throne, unmoved. For in the eyes of the gods, punishment need not be fair, only lasting, and Medusa's face would last longer than memory. Banished from the temple and city, Medusa wandered into the wilderness, alone, cursed and feared. Her steps carved a trail of stone across the land, each accidental glance at a passing creature, turning it to lifeless marble. Birds mid-flight, deer in the brush, even insects that dared meet her gaze. Frozen forever in silence, she sought refuge where no man would follow, in the distant lands beyond rivers and ruin, to a bleak, wind-swept island at the edge of the world, a place untouched by gods or mortals. There she built no shelter. What use was a roof when the stars offered no comfort? What use were walls when her enemies had once been her protectors? The cave she entered was already half filled with statues, long-forgotten warriors, beasts, or perhaps even fellow wanderers who met her eyes for a moment too long. And so began her second life, not as a priestess, but as a pariah. Medusa no longer wept. Tears belonged to the girl she once was, the girl who believed in justice, who offered incense to Athena, who thought love could be earned through loyalty. That girl had died on the temple floor. In her place stood something else. Not a monster, but a woman shaped by betrayal. Her serpents whispered to her in dreams, not in words, but in instincts. Warnings of intruders, echoes of approaching footsteps. Her hair had become her guardians, her eyes, her curse, her soul, a flickering memory. She began carving the walls of her cave with images. Faces, hands, the temple she once served, even her sisters. Her memories were fading, and stone was all she had left. Occasionally heroes would come, lured by stories of a cursed maiden, or tempted by the challenge of slaying a beast. They believed she was evil, that by killing her they might rise in glory, but none of them returned. They underestimated her, not just her power, but her pain. And yet, with each death, Medusa felt less like a victim, and more like the very monster the world imagined. Her humanity had not died, but it was fading. And the gods, they had already looked away. Far from Medusa's cave, in the bustling city-states and sacred temples of Greece, her name began to change. No longer spoken in mourning, it passed from mouth to mouth like a warning, distorted, retold, and reshaped Medusa the Gorgon. Medusa the cursed temptress. Medusa, whose gaze turns men to stone. Her past as a devoted priestess, a mortal girl who served the gods, was buried beneath myth. In its place rose a monster's tale, a creature with serpent hair whose eyes held the wrath of the underworld. They didn't tell of Poseidon's violation. They didn't mention Athena's cruel punishment. The gods' roles were edited out, smoothed over by priests and poets who preferred their gods spotless and their monsters clearly marked. Children were warned to obey their parents, or Medusa would come in the night. Soldiers carved her image onto shields, not to honor her, but to mock her. Her face became a symbol of fear, a cautionary tale. And yet her image spread. Artists painted her on pottery. Her twisted silhouette danced across mosaics. Her snarling face was carved into temple walls, not in reverence, but as a weapon used by the very gods who had cast her out. Medusa from exile could only feel the weight of their words. She didn't ask to become a legend. She didn't ask to be feared. She had simply survived. And survival to those in power is threatening on the mainland. Some whispered of her as more than a monster. Old women in mountain villages left offerings near caves, murmuring that Medusa protected women who had been hurt. They didn't fear her. They pitied her. They called her guardian of the wronged. But these voices were soft, and the roar of hero myths drowned them out. Medusa remained hidden, unaware of how deeply her name had split. Monster to some, martyr to others. What she did know was this. No matter how far she hid, they would keep coming. Men with swords and shining armor. Men who thought killing her meant glory. Men who had never cared who she was, only what she had become. And somewhere a new challenger was already being born, a boy who would grow into a man, a hero, and her final visitor. While Medusa lived in exile, her legend, spreading like wildfire, a boy named Perseus was born to a different kind of silence, a prison of prophecy. His mother, Danae, had been locked away in a bronze tower by her father, King Acrisius, desperate to stop a prophecy that her son would one day cause his death. But the gods don't respect mortal locks. Zeus came to denial not with love, but his golden rain slipping past walls and warnings from that divine encounter. Perseus was born. When the king discovered the child, he dared not kill a son of Zeus directly. So he cast mother and infant into the sea, sealed in a wooden chest, a quiet execution wrapped in cowardice. But the sea, ruled by Poseidon, carried them not to death, but to refuge. They washed ashore on the island of Seriphos, where a fisherman took them in. Danae raised Perseus in hiding, teaching him strength, humility, and the silence of survival. She never spoke Zeus's name. She never told her son what kind of god had sired him. Years passed. Perseus grew into a sharp-eyed young man, clever, strong, but untested. And then came the king of Seriphos, Polydectes. He wanted Danae for himself. Perseus stood in the way. The king, feigning kindness, invited Perseus to a feast. Each guest was to bring a gift. Perseus, poor and proud, brought nothing. Polydectes sneered. Then bring me the head of Medusa. Laughter followed. It was meant to humiliate him. But Perseus, stung by pride and unaware of the truth behind the name, accepted. The gods watched with interest. Athena, perhaps still nursing guilt over what she'd done to Medusa, saw an opportunity. She would aid this boy, not for justice, but for balance. She and Hermes came to Perseus in dreams, whispering guidance. They gave him tools, winged sandals to fly, a polished shield like a mirror, an adamantine sword, and the helm of Hades to vanish from sight. But no gift came without purpose. Perseus had been chosen not just to kill a monster, but to complete a myth, one that began not with him, but with a girl alone in a temple, praying to gods who never listened. Perseus set off with divine tools at his side and the weight of a king's challenge on his shoulders. But finding Medusa was not as simple as crossing land or sea. Her location had been buried by time, hidden even from the god who had cursed her. To find her, Perseus needed answers that no mortal could give. He sought out the Grey, 3 ancient sisters who shared a single eye and a single tooth between them. They were older than gods, draped in shadow and spite, living in the void between light and nightmare. They knew where Medusa slept, for they were her kin. Perseus didn't beg. He didn't plead. He waited until one of the sisters passed the eye to another and snatched it from their hands. Tell me he demanded, holding their only vision hostage, or remain blind forever. They hissed, but they spoke. They told him of a distant island, beyond mortal maps, past crags that tore ships to splinters, where stone statues littered the shores like fallen soldiers. An island where no bird sang, and no stars dared linger. The lair of Medusa. And so Perseus flew, sandals slicing through clouds, heart pounding, not with fear, but anticipation. He saw himself returning to Seriphos with a head in his hands, triumphant, Danae proud, Polydectes humbled. He did not yet question the story he'd been told, that Medusa was a monster, that she deserved to die. The gods had prepared him, but they had not warned him. They had not said that her cave was lined with the remains of men who called themselves heroes. They had not said that her eyes were not cruel, only cursed. And they had not said that her face, beneath the serpents behind the myth, still carried the shape of a woman once full of faith. As he flew across the sea, the winds howled louder, as if trying to speak. But Perseus heard only silence, the silence the gods knew well. Because when you create a monster, the last thing you want is for someone to hear her speak. When Perseus landed on the shores of the island, the world seemed to hold its breath. No breeze, no birdsong, only statues, hundreds of them, scattered like fallen warriors across the cliffs and crags. Their faces were twisted in terror, mouths frozen mid-scream, eyes wide with the last thing they ever saw her. He stepped over stone limbs and shattered shields. His sword sheathed, his mirrored shield held tight. Athena had warned him. Never look at her directly. Use reflection. Be swift, be silent. But what the goddess hadn't said was why the statues looked not just terrified, but surprised, as if in their final second they'd realized they were off. Perseus moved deeper into the cavern, wings folding behind him. The air was thick with damp moss snake musk. And something else? Sorrow. The serpents hissed before he saw her, a low symphony of warning and weariness. Then she appeared, not charging, not roaring, not even aware. Medusa slept, coiled on a bed of stone, arms curled around herself like a child. Her face in the mirrored shield was peaceful, fragile. A strange beauty lingered. Though her features were half hidden beneath the tangle of venomous serpents that rested for now in slumber, she did not look like a monster. She looked like someone who had been left behind. Perseus hesitated. This was not the roaring beast sung about in legends, not the terror painted on urns and shields. She was just a woman, cursed, asleep, and utterly alone. But the gods had given him a task. He remembered his mother. He remembered the mocking voice of Polydectes. He remembered glory. And so he raised the sword, his eyes fixed on the mirrored shield. He took one step closer. A snake lifted its head. Medusa stirred. Her eyes fluttered, still closed. She did not scream. She did not fight. She barely breathed. And in that moment, Perseus struck. The blade hissed through the air with a divine edge. Silence followed. When her head fell into the satchel lined with bronze scales, the island exhaled. The curse was done, or so he thought. Because you can kill a body, but not a story. And Medusa's story was just beginning. Perseus didn't linger, with Medusa's head sealed in the enchanted satchel, its gaze still potent even in death. He rose into the sky, sandals beating against the clouds, but the silence of the island clung to him. Not a silence of victory, something colder. The head still pulsed with quiet power. Though severed, it was not lifeless. The snakes writhed, tongues flickering, sensing the world beyond the bag. Her eyes remained open, unblinking, capable of petrifying anything that dared peer within. Perseus didn't look. He dared not. The gods had given him a weapon now, a divine trump card. But he began to feel uneasy carrying it. As he flew across the ocean, creatures of shadow stirred in the waves. For this act, though heroic in the mortal realm, had awakened old pacts. Medusa's death had not gone unnoticed. Deep in the sea, her slayer had disturbed the balance. Poseidon felt it. Athena knew it. The fates wove quietly, and far above Olympus the storm began to gather. Still, Perseus pressed on. His thoughts were consumed with what came next. He would return to Seriphos. He would silence King Polydectes, free his mother, and restore his name. He would be a hero. That's what the stories promised. But the weight of the satchel told another tale. He remembered the mirrored shield and the face he'd seen. She hadn't snarled. She hadn't lunged. She'd been sleeping. Was that truly a monster, or had he killed a warning wrapped in misunderstanding? He pushed the thought aside. The gods had guided him, hadn't they? But as the wind howled louder, Perseus noticed something odd. The head was humming, not a sound, but a sensation, as if it still remembered the world, as if the soul of Medusa, cursed, betrayed, mutilated, still looked outward, still aware, still waiting. And though Perseus would go on to slay monsters, rescue maidens, and carve his name into the stars, he would never again sleep soundly, because sometimes at night he swore he heard the faint rattle of snakes beneath his bedroll, and sometimes he dreamed not of victory, but of a girl kneeling in a temple, begging the gods to protect her. Perseus returned to Seriphos with wind-swept hair, divine armor, and the head of a legend tucked under his cloak. The people greeted him with cheers, unaware of what lay in the satchel, unaware of what it had cost. But King Polydectes was no fool. He had never expected the boy to survive. His challenge had been a death sentence wrapped in mockery. So when Perseus strode into the palace, head held high, the king's sneer quickly turned to unease. "You brought me a gift?" Polydectes mocked, trying to hold on to control. Perseus nodded once. "Token of your request." And with that, he opened the satchel. For a brief second, Polydectes met the gaze of Medusa. Just a second. It was enough. Stone cracked through his skin like frost on glass. His eyes froze wide. His final breath was trapped behind lips turned to granite. The king, so smug, so cruel, was now nothing more than a statue. The room erupted in screams. Courtiers fled. Some fell to their knees. Perseus remained silent, his expression unreadable. His mother, Danae, rushed to embrace him, finally free. And still, Perseus said nothing about the girl in the cave. To them, Medusa was a monster, defeated, a tool used, an obstacle overcome. No one asked who she had been, but Perseus remembered the way her body fell, the way her face in the mirror had not snarled, but pleaded. Still, the story spread quickly. Songs were sung, temples raised. Perseus was called Gorgon Slayer, champion of the gods, breaker of curses. They etched his name into marble, never once carving hers beside it. In his later years, he placed Medusa's head on Athena's shield by the goddess's own command. Her face, once scorned, was now turned outward as a weapon of divine justice. But not justice for her. Justice for others. Even in death, Medusa served. Even in silence, her power remained. And Perseus, the golden hero, walked beneath that shield for years to come, every victory won with the face of the woman he had slain. He was loved, she was feared, and neither could change the roles the gods had written for them. After Perseus's triumph, Athena summoned him to Olympus, not just to praise him, but to claim what had always belonged to her. Not the sword, nor the sandals, nor the helm of Hades. She wanted the head of Medusa. Perseus obeyed, offering the satchel without question, and with practiced grace, Athena took the severed head of her former priestess and affixed it to her shield, her aegis, turning it into a weapon of legend. The Gorgon's face, once radiant, once innocent, now snarled in frozen rage from the bronze curve of the goddess's arm. Wherever Athena marched, war followed. Enemies turned to stone at the sight of it. Cities fell. Statues of the Aegis spread across temples and coinage. Her shield became both warning and banner. But no one ever asked why Medusa had been cursed in the first place. Athena, the goddess of wisdom, carried the face of a woman she had once punished, not as a reminder, not out of guilt, but as a symbol of divine power, of what happens when mortals overstep. Yet some whispered differently. Some said Athena was not reclaiming a weapon, but granting Medusa immortality, that by placing her on the Aegis, she ensured Medusa would never be forgotten. That the girl who had once cried in her temple was now etched into eternity, where even the gods had to carry the consequences of their actions. But the truth is always with gods, was layered in paradox. Athena had condemned Medusa for shaming her temple, and now she wielded that same shame. As a trophy, the transformation was complete. Medusa had been a priestess, then a victim, then a monster. Now a weapon, an icon. And yet, somewhere in the curve of that sculpted jaw, in the tragic slant of her petrified eyes, something still lived. Something the world couldn't unsee. Because even as she turned armies to stone, there were always a few, just a few, who looked upon her face and didn't see a monster. They saw a question, a protest, a warning, and that is a power no blade could match. Medusa's face now stared outward from Athena's aegis, unblinking, eternal. To most, it was a symbol of divine terror, of enemies turned to stone, of battles won with a single glance. But to those who looked closer, that gaze held something more than fury. It held memories. It held injustice. It held the truth no temple scroll ever dared to write. Through the centuries, warriors marched behind that shield, unaware that the face they wielded once belonged to a woman who had never raised a hand in violence. Her curse, gifted by the gods, had become a tool of the empire. The weaponization of her trauma was complete. Still, her eyes continued to see. Long after her voice had been silenced, her gaze bore witness to 1,000 battles. She watched kings rise and fall. She saw temples crumble and heroes turn cruel. She saw altars raised to men who had called her a monster, and prayers whispered by women who understood what she had lost. And sometimes those women left offerings. Tiny clay serpents placed at hidden shrines, a lock of hair wrapped in cloth, a whispered name buried in the dark. Not out of fear, but remembrance. Because long before Medusa became a cautionary tale, she had been a protector. Her cave had become a graveyard of conquerors. Yes, but also a sanctuary. A place no man could enter and survive. A place where the hunt became untouchable. In time, her legend fractured. To some, she remained the Gorgon. To others, she became something else entirely, a symbol of resistance, a goddess of wrath and wounded justice, a spirit that stood between the powerless and the predators. Her myth bent and twisted as myths do, but the core remained. A woman wronged, a woman reshaped by pain, a woman whose story had been stolen, but whose stare could never be taken away. And so her gaze endured across paintings, sculptures, shields, coins, and dreams. And in every retelling, someone new would pause. Someone would ask, was she really the monster? And in that question, Medusa lived again. Centuries passed. Empires crumbled. New gods rose and fell. But Medusa endured not as flesh and blood, but as symbol and shadow. Her face, chiseled into marble and cast in bronze, migrated across cultures. In Byzantium, in Rome, in forgotten corners of the world, her image lingered just beneath the surface of myth and memory. But something strange happened over time. The tale began to split. In one version, she remained the monster, the Gorgon, the serpent-haired killer who turned men to stone with a glare. Her head became a talisman against evil, mounted above doors, gates, and armor. Soldiers carried her into war, hoping her legend would strike fear deeper than any spear. But another story quietly grew alongside it, one whispered by poets, philosophers, and women whose voices rarely made it into scrolls. In this story, Medusa was not a beast to be slain, but a wronged woman, punished for beauty, cursed for a crime committed against her. This version didn't roar. It murmured. It asked why a goddess of wisdom would punish her own servant, why the god of the sea would face no consequence, why so many men sought to kill her when she simply wanted to be left alone. In taverns, in libraries, in hidden corners of temples, these questions bloomed like weeds in cracks of marble, and slowly the image of Medusa began to shift again. She became a mirror, not of terror, but of truth. Women began to see themselves in her, survivors of violence, victims of silence, souls forced to wear the label of monster simply for being feared. Her serpents were no longer a punishment, but a crown, her eyes not a curse, but a defense sharpened by betrayal. Even now, in modern tales and art, Medusa rises again, not to petrify, but to testify. She stares from paintings with grief and fury. Her story is retold not to glorify Perseus, but to ask why he was called a hero at all. Because myths evolve, and sometimes the monster is not the one with fangs, but the one holding the sword. And in every generation that dares to question the old story, Medusa blinks just once and watches them begin to understand. The first thing that hit you when you walked into a Wild West saloon wasn't the piano music or the sound of someone losing a week's wages at cards. It was the smell. Forget the romanticized scent of sizzling steak and fresh cornbread. The real bouquet was more like a punch in the nostrils. A complex blend of sweaty cowboys, wet tobacco, old beer, damp wood, horses that hadn't bathed in a decade, and if you were lucky, the faintest hint of something cooking in the back. Some saloons try to mask it with sawdust on the floor or pipe smoke thick enough to cause temporary memory loss. Others just embraced it. You don't come here for the air, barkeeps would say, slapping flies off the counter with a rag that hadn't been cleaned since the Civil War. And yet, somehow, there was always a kitchen. It might have been a hole-in-the-wall fire pit with a pan of beans bubbling over embers. It might have been a grumpy woman in a soot-covered apron stirring mystery stew with a spoon that doubled as a self-defense weapon. But food was being made somewhere. And if you could smell it through the sweat and the whiskey vapor, you were halfway to dinner. That is, if you could find a seat. Most saloons weren't laid out like modern restaurants. There were no servers, no menus with scripted fonts, just a few splintered tables, some rickety chairs, and one long counter where you could eat, drink, argue, or all three in rapid succession. If you were a regular, the cook might shout something like beans or stew, and you shouted back your choice without looking up. If you were new in town, they'd stare you down, trying to guess whether you were going to pay or pass out before the plate hit the table. And that's what made saloon dining so special. It wasn't about taste. It was about survival. You ate what they had, not what you wanted. You sat next to strangers who might rob you or save your life tomorrow. And if the food made you sick, well, that's what whiskey was for in the hierarchy of Wild West cuisine. Beans sat squarely at the top, not because they were delicious, but because they were cheap, indestructible, and could survive an apocalypse, a gunfight, and a stampede without breaking a sweat. Pinto beans, black beans, navy beans, it didn't matter. If it was dry, vaguely edible, and could be boiled into submission, it ended up in the pot. Beans were the unsung heroes of saloon kitchens, served morning, noon, and night, often to men who hadn't seen a vegetable since they left Kansas. Preparation was simple. Step 1. Pour beans into a pot. Step 2. Boil them for 6 hours over a questionable fire. Step 3. Serve them with salt pork, a stale biscuit, and a look of mild apology. Some cooks tried to get fancy, adding lard, onions, or even chili powder if they were feeling ambitious, but most didn't bother. In the Wild West, flavor was considered a luxury, and seasoning was whatever blew in from the open window. Beans were hearty, filling, and predictable, 3 traits that cowboys respected more than gold. They fueled long cattle drives, powered poker nights, and gave you something to chew on while you waited for the piano player to start again, or for someone to get tossed through the front window. The only downside? Aftermath. 1 cowboy eating beans was tolerable. 10 cowboys in a saloon full of beans was a biological weapon. It said that some bar fights weren't started by insults, but by a single silent but deadly betrayal near the stove. Still, beans were dependable. When the meat ran out, when the chickens fled, and when the cook had exactly 7 brain cells left from the whiskey fumes, the beans remained unbothered, unburnt, unchanged. Some cowboys even preferred them. They could be eaten cold, reheated endlessly, and used as makeshift currency in emergencies. Legend has it a man once bought a horse with 3 pounds of salted beans and a promise never to return. So yes, saloon food had its highs and lows. But beans? Beans were the baseline, the bedrock, the humble heartbeat of 1,000 dusty meals. You didn't love them. You respected them. And sometimes, that was enough. If beans were the soul of Wild West saloon cuisine, salt pork was its slightly greasier backbone, a slab of fat and meat so tough it could survive a thunderstorm, a bar brawl, and 6 months in a saddlebag without changing texture. Salt pork wasn't bacon, though cowboys loved to pretend it was. It was pork belly, heavily salted and often smoked, preserved in barrels with enough brine to season a small ocean. The salt kept it from rotting, and also arguably from being edible. Cooked right, salt pork was tolerable. Fried up in a hot skillet, served crispy and sizzling. It had flavor, grease, and that satisfying crunch that made you briefly forget the rest of your dinner came from a can. But cooked wrong, which happened often, it was like chewing a salted boot heel dipped in axle grease. Still, salt pork had its fans. It was easy to transport, hard to ruin, though many tried, and gave even the blandest pod of beans a salty punch of joy, or at least a reason to drink more whiskey. Cooks in saloons didn't waste a single bit. The fat used to fry everything from potatoes to biscuits, the rinds tossed into stews or given to dogs, or to unlucky newcomers who didn't know the difference. One bite, and they'd learn real quick that the barkeep wasn't joking when he said chew slow or choke proud. And yes, sometimes the pork was suspicious. A greenish tinge here, a questionable smell there. But in saloons, the motto wasn't, "Is it fresh?" It was more like, "Did it kill the last guy?" If not, you gave it a try. Salt pork was versatile too. It could be diced into beans, slapped on biscuits, fried alone, or gnawed it like jerky on long rides. Cowboys packed it like treasure. And saloon cooks leaned on it when the chickens ran off or the stew pot got too thin. It wasn't elegant, and it sure wasn't healthy. But in a world where you might ride 60 miles before your next hot meal, salt pork got the job done. And if you survived it, well, you were stronger for it. In the Wild West, stew was the great culinary equalizer, hot, vaguely meaty, and deeply suspicious. It was the one thing almost every saloon served, no matter how ramshackle the kitchen. Why? Because stew was the perfect cover story for whatever odds and ends the cook had lying around or couldn't legally describe. The base was simple: a pot, a fire, and ambition. You started with water, maybe some beans or potatoes, and then you tossed in whatever hadn't walked away yet. Beef? Sure. Rabbit? Definitely. Squirrel? Yep. Rattlesnake? If it wasn't biting anymore, toss it in. One traveler once claimed he found a boot string in his bowl. He wasn't even mad. It was the most chewable part. Meat quality varied wildly. Some stews had tender chunks of beef from the local butcher. Others, well, they had meat, the kind you didn't ask about. If the cook looked nervous and the dog population had recently decreased, you just ate around the chewy bits and prayed. Vegetables, when available, were usually boiled into oblivion. Carrots became orange smudges. Onions disappeared completely. Potatoes held on the longest, but eventually surrendered. The result? A bubbling brown-gray slurry that smelled way better than it looked and tasted better than you'd expect, assuming enough salt. Spices were a luxury. Most stew got its kick from whatever was on the cook's hands or knife. If you got black pepper, you were in a fancy place. If you got chili powder, congratulations, your sinuses were about to be cleared by force. But despite the mystery, stew was comfort food for the weary cowboy. It was hot, it was filling, and it could be stretched endlessly by just adding water. One pot might feed a dozen men or be reheated 3 days in a row until it developed the consistency and personality of old glue. You didn't eat stew because it was delicious. You ate it because it was there, because it was warm, and because nothing else in town was edible unless you liked chewing tobacco and regretting it. Just remember, never ask what's in it. Because in the Wild West, ignorance wasn't just bliss, it was dinner. Not every cowboy could afford steak, but nearly every saloon had something bread like to soak up the stew. That something usually came in one of two forms: soft, flaky biscuits that were heavenly when fresh, or hardtack, which was basically bread's undead cousin. Let's start with the biscuits. When done right, which was rare but magical, they were warm, buttery, and flaky enough to convince a man he'd stumbled into a proper kitchen. Cooks who could make good biscuits were local legends. Some claimed their secret was lard. Others swore by buttermilk. A few probably just had lucky hands and low standards. These biscuits were best served alongside beans or stew, used to mop up whatever broth hadn't burned your tongue. They were often made in cast iron pans, baked over open flames, and served with a suspicious chunk of butter or a splash of molasses if the place was fancy. And then there was hardtack, a slab of flour and water baked until it could survive nuclear winter. Originally made for soldiers and sailors, it found its way thanks to one simple fact: it never went bad. It also barely qualified as food. Eating hardtack required strategy. First, you'd inspect it for weevils, which wasn't a deal breaker, just an added crunch. Then you'd soak it in stew, coffee, or whiskey until it softened. This could take anywhere from 10 minutes to 2 presidential terms. Even after soaking, chewing hardtack was commitment. You didn't just eat it, you grappled with it. Dentists probably made good money off cowboys who challenged the peace and lost. But here's the thing: both biscuits and hardtack served their purpose. They were cheap. They were portable. They filled you up. And in a world where calories mattered more than cuisine, that was enough. So if you strolled into a dusty saloon and saw a plate of steaming biscuits, you counted your blessings. If they handed you a hardtack puck the size of your palm, well, at least it came with a story and maybe a chipped tooth. If you think modern coffee is strong, try cowboy coffee. A brew so potent it didn't just wake you up, it stared back and dared you to blink. Coffee in the Wild West was less about taste and more about survival. It wasn't roasted by origin, filtered through fancy gadgets, or topped with oat milk foam art. It was ground roughly, or not dumped into a kettle, and boiled until the liquid turned black and sentient. The standard recipe went like this. Take water from whatever source you had, hopefully not downstream from horses. Throw in a handful of coffee grounds, measured by instinct and aggression. Boil it hard. Don't strain it. Don't question it. Just pour and pray. The result? A thick, dark concoction that smelled like burnt dreams and tasted like vengeance. It wasn't uncommon for the last sip to contain more grounds than liquid, which meant cowboys got both caffeine and fiber in one heroic gulp. And yet they loved it. Coffee keeps you warm on cold desert mornings. It kept you awake through night watches. It masked hangovers and helped digest questionable stew. It was fuel, comfort, and punishment, all in one tin cup. Saloons didn't always serve coffee unless they had a kitchen, but if they did, it came out boiling hot, probably old and strong enough to strip paint. One cowboy described it as like drinking a kick from a mule, but you miss it when it's gone. Fancy folk might have added sugar or canned milk if available. Everyone else just grimaced and powered through, and if a saloon had been reheating the same pot all day, you'd get the boldest brew known to man. Thick as tar and twice as resentful, it's worth noting that some cooks reused old grounds to stretch the pot. This economy method led to coffee that tasted like disappointment and regret, but it still counted. Because in the Wild West, you didn't drink coffee for pleasure. You drank it to feel alive and stay that way. In the Wild West, meat wasn't just food. It was currency, status, and occasionally a test of bravery. If you could afford it, you might walk into a saloon and order a steak. What you got depended entirely on luck, timing, and whether the cook held a personal grudge against your face. Steak, in theory, was a luxury. In reality, it was often a tough, overcooked slab of beef that had been fried in a pan with lard, scorched into obedience, and served with exactly zero garnish if you asked for medium rare. The cook would just stare at you until your mustache wilted. When fresh beef wasn't available, and let's be honest, it usually wasn't, saloons turned to other options. Dry jerky, salted buffalo, occasionally venison, or even wild boar if someone had gotten lucky on a hunt. And by lucky, we mean managed to hit it and drag it back before the buzzards did. In mining towns or far-flung settlements, meat got more creative. Squirrel stew, rattlesnake roast, roast jackrabbit with seasoning. If it had legs and didn't belong to a customer's horse, it was fair game. Sometimes you were served meat and no one told you what it was. That was a sign to eat quietly and not ask questions. If you chewed too long or found something resembling a whisker, you just sipped your whiskey, nodded solemnly, and accepted your fate. There is also the risk of age. Some meats have been hanging around long enough to earn names. Cooks would slice off the bad parts, drown the rest in gravy, and tell you it was well aged. If your plate twitched when you poked it, you were entitled to one raised eyebrow and nothing more. Still, when the meat was fresh and the cook wasn't drunk, you might get a real meal. A sizzling slab of beef, a fried egg on top, and maybe a biscuit on the side. A plate that reminded you why people survived gunfights for this. But most of the time you ate what was there and hoped it didn't eat you back. In a Wild West saloon, dessert wasn't really a category. It was more of a happy accident, the result of a cook with spare ingredients and a tiny sliver of mercy. But if there was one reliable Swedish comfort, it was cornbread made from simple cornmeal, water, or milk. Lard and sometimes a dash of baking powder, if the cook remembered. Cornbread was the Swiss Army knife of the frontier menu. It could be baked in pans, fried in skillets, or even dropped by spoonfuls into boiling stew. If someone was in a hurry or lazy alone, cornbread was dry, crumbly, slightly sweet depending on who made it, and always best served fresh, which meant it was almost never fresh. More often, you get a wedge that had been sitting near the stove since sunrise, hardened like a miner's conscience. But here's where the magic happened. Molasses. A dark, sticky, syrupy miracle that turned dry cornbread into something just shy of glorious. It was the cowboy's frosting, the outlaw's drizzle, the lonely gambler's last bit of joy before losing everything on a bad hand. Molasses was affordable, kept well in the heat, and masked the sins of even the driest baked goods. If a saloon had a barrel of it, you were in luck. If they warmed it before serving, you were practically eating at a five-star establishment by frontier standards. Some cooks went a step further, pouring molasses over skillet-fried cornbread and tossing in a pinch of salt or spice. It wasn't quite cake, but it felt like it if you've been chewing jerky and hardtack all week. Cornbread with molasses became the default dessert. Quick, cheap, filling, and sweet enough to calm your nerves after a rough ride or a close call in the poker room. No icing, no whipped cream, no frills. Just grit, grain, and gooey satisfaction. And for many, it was more than enough. Because when your life involved cattle drives, dust storms, and the occasional shootout, dessert didn't need to sparkle. It just needed to remind you that not everything in the West was trying to kill you. If you were lucky enough to stumble into a saloon before noon, preferably sober and not bleeding, you might have been offered eggs and chicken. And if so, you were in the presence of a miracle or a trap. Let's start with eggs. Fresh eggs in the wild West were gold. Not actual gold, but nearly as rare and equally fragile. Chickens weren't raised for fun. They were cranky, prone to wandering, and occasionally stolen, eaten, or lost to foxes. If a saloon had eggs on hand, they either had their own chickens, a local supplier, or a secret smuggling operation from the next town over. What kind of eggs were they? Hopefully chicken, possibly duck, maybe something else. You learned not to ask. You ordered eggs, and what you got depended entirely on the cook's mood and the egg's age. Some were scrambled to disguise color. Others were fried until the yolks turned to leather. And if it wobbled when it hit your plate, that was a sign from the universe to order whiskey instead. As for chicken, it was on the menu, but not often. If it said fried chicken, what you'd probably get was a scrawny bird that died angry. Tough, bony, and fried in lard until the flavor tapped out. Chicken wasn't always worth chewing, but it was meat. It was hot, and it wasn't beans again, so folks ate it gratefully. You might get a drumstick the size of your thumb, or a whole quarter roasted on an open flame. You might also get a feather in your gravy, and that was just part of the charm. Breakfast offerings of eggs and chicken were a status symbol for saloons. They said, "We have food that didn't come from a can or a barrel." If the eggs were warm and the chicken wasn't dry, you'd tell your buddies for weeks. And if it gave you food poisoning, well, that was just the West reminding you who was in charge. Still, there was something hopeful about ordering eggs. They meant morning. They meant survival. And just maybe, they meant you'd live to drink again by nightfall. In a Wild West saloon, pie was more than just dessert. It was a statement. If you saw a pie sitting on a bar, steam rising, crust golden, scent of apples wafting through the smoke and whiskey, you knew this saloon meant business. You also knew that someone in the kitchen had put in real effort, which was practically a love letter in a land of bean slop and overcooked pork. Now don't get ahead of yourself. Pie in the Wild West wasn't a perfect lattice-topped pastry with farm-fresh fruit. It was a rough, rustic affair. Uneven crusts, fillings made from canned or dried fruit, and usually served lukewarm at best. Whipped cream, not unless a cow followed you into town. The most common varieties were apple, peach, or berry. Berry being a flexible category that sometimes included raisins or things that only vaguely resembled berries. If the cook had a sweet tooth, you might get a dash of cinnamon. If not, you got crushed sugar. And optimism. Still, pie was a rare treat. Most cowboys hadn't seen one since they left home, and saloons knew that offering pie gave them a competitive edge. A good slice could pull customers from 2 towns over, and if the pie was warm and flaky, you better believe someone would threaten to shoot over the last piece. There are recorded stories, and a few exaggerated legends, of poker games that ended in gunfire over desert disputes. You took the last slice as a valid offense as cheating at cards. In a world where men had been stabbed over spilled whiskey, pie was practically sacred. Of course, not all pies were created equal. Some were mostly crust, some were experimental. Some had fillings that hinted at being fruit once in a previous life. But if the stars aligned, the cook was sober, the oven was hot, and the fruit wasn't fermenting, then that pie was something to remember. Because in the dust and grit of the frontier, a slice of pie wasn't just food. It was hope served on a tin plate. Cheese in the Wild West was a lot like a poker game, full of risk, a little bluffing, and a strong chance you'd regret your choices the next morning. It did exist, yes, but only if you knew where to look. And even then you had to be brave because cheese wasn't shipped in tidy wheels wrapped in wax paper. It was made locally, often by someone who once read about dairy fermentation while drunk. Most saloon cheese came in two varieties, hard, yellow, and suspiciously sweaty, or soft, crumbly, and slightly aggressive to the nose refrigeration. That was a luxury. So unless it was a particularly cold month, or the saloon was near a cave, chances are your cheese has developed a personality. It might be cheddar. It might be something vaguely Swiss. It might be a lump of dairy guesswork with salt on top. And if it squeaked when you bit into it, well, that was between you and your jaw. Cheese was usually served in chunks alongside bread, jerky, or if you were lucky, a pickle. It helped balance out the saltiness of everything else and gave cowboys a protein boost between brawls. You could even melt it over beans or toast it on cornbread, assuming the cook was feeling artistic. But beware, some saloons cut corners. Cheese might be old butter gone wrong, or curdled milk pressed into a bar shape and rolled in pepper to distract you. One traveling merchant once said he bought cheese in Nevada that tasted like boiled sock with a rind. He still ate the whole thing, because even bad cheese was still cheese. And in the Wild West, a saloon that offered any cheese at all stood out. It meant the owner had connections to a local farm, or at least access to a cow that hadn't been rustled yet. Offering cheese wasn't about flavor. It was a flex, a symbol of civilization in a place where most people still bathe with sand. So if a saloon plate came with a slice of cheese, you'd do it. Sniff it, tap it with your fork, and then eat it anyway. Because in the West, a gamble was just part of dinner. If it could be soaked in vinegar and forgotten in a jar, chances are it was served in a Wild West saloon. Pickling wasn't just a flavor choice, it was a survival strategy. Before refrigeration, saloon kitchens relied on brine and sourness to keep food from crawling off the shelf. Vegetables, eggs, fruit, even meat. Nothing was safe from the preserving power of vinegar. And that's how we got pickled everything. Pickled cucumbers? The classic. Crunchy, sharp, and occasionally green. They were served as sides, chasers for whiskey, or just something to chew on between bad decisions. If you were lucky, they were made fresh with garlic and spice. If not, they tasted like regret and rainwater. Pickled eggs? A saloon staple. You'd see them floating in cloudy jars behind the bar, usually near the whiskey. They looked like ghostly eyeballs and had the texture of sadness. Some cowboys swore by them. A quick shot of protein, easy to store, and they mostly stayed down. Others swore at them. Pickled onions, common in mining towns. Sharp, tangy, and strong enough to chase off unwanted conversation. One bite, and you could talk downwind of a stampede. Even pickled peaches or pears might make an appearance when dried fruit was soaked in sweet brine to create a dish both confusing and strangely addictive. It wasn't dessert. It wasn't dinner. It was just wet, vinegary optimism. The beauty of pickled goods was their shelf life. A saloon could keep jars around for months, sometimes years, without worrying about spoilage. And in a place where meat went bad faster than a poker hand, that was invaluable. But let's be honest, not all pickled items were created equal. Sometimes the jars weren't sealed right. Sometimes the cook experimented. And sometimes the pickled thing stared back at you. There are tales, possibly exaggerated, of men biting into pickled sausages only to find bones, or a label that simply read, maybe pork. Still, pickled foods were part of the Wild West experience. Salty, sour, and strangely satisfying. Like everything else that lasted out there, you didn't eat them for pleasure. You ate them because they wouldn't kill you. Probably when food was scarce, the kitchen was closed, or the stew looked like it still had a pulse. Cowboys and drifters alike turned to the most dependable item on the saloon menu, whiskey. It was always available. It required no preparation, and if you drank enough of it, you forgot you were hungry or that you just eaten a bowl of squirrel mystery meat. Whiskey in the Wild West wasn't aged in oak barrels or curated by connoisseurs. It was rough, raw, and often dangerous. Made from corn, rye, or whatever the barkeep had lying around, it was distilled in back rooms, barns, and bathtubs. The result was a beverage that could clean wounds, strip paint, and fuel a fist fight. Some called it rot gut, others chain lightning, and a few simply referred to it as lunch. When beans were burnt and bread was moldy, men drank their calories, one burning shot at a time. Saloon whiskey wasn't just a drink, it was a survival tool. It helped numb the pain of trail dust, heartbreak, broken ribs, and highly questionable stew. One shot before a duel, 2 shots after, and maybe 3 more while you waited to see if your bullet wound was serious. It was common for saloons to serve whiskey specials, which came with a side of beans or a biscuit, not for flavor, but to keep you upright. Some men ordered whiskey with a pickled egg floating in it, which somehow counted as both hydration and protein. And of course, whiskey was social glue. You bought it to make friends, to start fights, and occasionally to apologize after both. You could measure a saloon's reputation by how fast its whiskey knocked a man off his stool. Quality? Don't ask. Some whiskey was barely more than colored moonshine. Additives ranged from tobacco juice to cayenne pepper. It burned going down, and if it didn't, you were probably drinking kerosene. Still, no one complained. Because whiskey was warm, cheap, and honest, the only thing on the menu that never lied about what it was. And on nights when your meal came in a glass with no fork and no judgment, you raised it high and called it dinner. In any Wild West saloon that dared serve food, there existed a shadowy, smoke-covered figure whose power rivaled that of the bartender, the sheriff, and the town preacher combined. The cook, this individual, often unshaven, always irritable, was either a life-saving genius or a culinary war criminal. There was no middle ground. You'd never see them smile, but you'd remember their cooking for days, either in gratitude or gastrointestinal trauma. Saloon cooks weren't trained chefs. They were usually ex-miners, ex-cons, or ex-somethings who knew how to build a fire and weren't afraid of questionable meat. Their kitchen, a fire pit, a dented stove, and a single cast iron pan that hadn't been washed since the gold rush. And yet, somehow they fed entire saloons. On a good day, they'd whip up a pot of chili that could bring a man to tears in a good way. The biscuits would be warm, the beans cooked through, and the cornbread just sweet enough to remind you of home. But on a bad day, the beans were scorched. The meat was gray, and the stew had an unsettling layer of oil that moved when the pot was still. You didn't complain. You couldn't. Saloon etiquette was clear. Never insult the cook because the cook controlled everything. The salt, the grease, the mystery meat ratio. If they liked you, you got the freshest cut. If not, you got the spoon scrapings from last night's disaster, reheated into chili surprise. They also doubled as the saloon's unofficial bouncer. No one wanted to get hit by a ladle that had just survived frying salt pork. And if the cook had a cleaver, which many did, they could clear a room faster than a shotgun. Despite their moods, these cooks were vital. They kept cowboys on their feet, miners from passing out, and travelers from collapsing mid-sentence. They worked long hours in heat and smoke, took insults as seasoning, and lived by a single rule. If you don't like it, there's the door or the whiskey. So whether they were your savior or your saboteur, you always nodded respectfully to the cook. Because in the Wild West, they held your stomach and your fate in their greasy, glorious hands. Now that we walked through the swinging doors, sniffed the stew, and stared down a pickled egg in a foggy jar, the real question remains, would you actually eat the food served at a Wild West saloon? Let's be honest, modern taste buds might not survive the experience. The beans were basic, the meat was a gamble, and the stew was more mystery than meal. You'd need strong teeth, a stronger stomach, and the kind of appetite that comes from riding 40 miles on a sunburned horse with nothing but dust in your lungs. But here's the thing. For the cowboys, miners, gamblers, and misfits of the American frontier, saloon food wasn't about gourmet flavor or Instagram-worthy plating. It was about fuel, calories, heat, a warm plate between gunfights, train robberies, or another night sleeping in a barn next to a mule named Regret. It was about survival. You didn't ask where the meat came from. You didn't complain if the biscuit crumbled like chalk. You just sat down, ate what was handed to you, and washed it down with something strong enough to kill bacteria, or at least make you stop caring about it. And when food was good, when the beans were fresh, the coffee didn't bite back, and the cook had spared a little molasses for the cornbread, it felt like a miracle. So would you eat it if you lived back then? Yes, you wouldn't just eat it. You'd be thankful for it. You'd scrape the bowl, wipe the plate with your crust of bread, and order seconds with coins that still smelled like dynamite and horse sweat. You'd laugh with strangers, curse the cook, toast with whiskey, and maybe, just maybe, end the night with a slice of pie and a story worth telling. Because saloon food wasn't glamorous. It was gritty, greasy, and real. And in a world where the West was still wild, that was enough. Long before tattoos were scrawled across biceps and backs in trendy shops with buzzing needles, they were something far older, etched not with fashion in mind, but with mystery, meaning, and survival. Let's rewind to a time when cities didn't exist, when gods hadn't yet been given names, and humans lived close to the bone in both spirit and skin. Enter Otzi the Iceman, discovered in 1991. Frozen in a glacier between Austria and Italy, his mummified body was over 5,000 years old, older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge. And yet, across his leathery skin, researchers found something incredibly modern. Tattoos. 61 of them, to be precise. They weren't ornamental spirals or stylized animals. They were dark carbon marks, dots and lines running down his spine, behind his knees and around his ankles. Here's where it gets wild. The locations of Otzi's tattoos matched known acupuncture points. Was this a primitive form of pain management, an ancient healing technique, or something more spiritual? A rite of endurance carved directly into the flesh? We'll never know for certain. But one thing is clear. Even in the Stone Age, humans were already marking their bodies with purpose, and Otzi wasn't alone. In ancient Egypt, tattoos appeared predominantly on women, including priestesses and dancers. These weren't decorative butterflies or names of lost lovers, but rather symbolic patterns, often placed around the abdomen, thighs, and chest. Some scholars believe these tattoos were intended to offer protection during childbirth, to channel fertility, or to ward off evil spirits, like spiritual armor drawn right onto the body. Even in Nubia, south of Egypt, archaeologists unearthed mummies with animal figures tattooed on their limbs. Bulls, crocodiles, symbols of power and survival. Across these early societies, tattoos weren't acts of rebellion. They were acts of reverence, resilience, and ritual. They carried meaning not in ink alone, but in pain, permanence, and belief. So next time you see someone's sleeve of ink at the gym or on the subway, remember they're carrying on a tradition that started not in the studio, but in the ice, in the sand, and in the sacred silence of forgotten millennia. If you ever thought tattoos were just edgy accessories or signs of rebellion, try saying that in front of a Polynesian chief and watch the room go quiet. In Polynesian cultures, tattoos weren't optional or decorative. They were sacred. In fact, the word tattoo itself comes from the Tahitian word tata, meaning to strike. And that's exactly how it began, with bone tools dipped in soot, rhythmically tapped into the skin with a stick, each strike echoing centuries of tradition. In places like Samoa, Tonga, and especially among the Maori of New Zealand, tattoos weren't just art, they were identity. A person's moko. The intricate facial tattoos of the Maori could tell you everything you needed to know. Their rank, their family, their ancestry, even their personal achievements. The face wasn't just a canvas, it was a living resume, and removing it would be like erasing a man's entire life. Young men would often receive their first tattoos during painful, ceremonial rites of passage. This wasn't a Friday night decision after a few drinks. It was a spiritual transformation. The process was excruciating. No anesthetics, no numbing creams, just raw courage and a communal belief in the deeper purpose of the pain. Women too were tattooed, often on the lips, chin, or thighs, symbols of beauty, maturity, and mana, the sacred power believed to flow through all living things. A woman without tattoos could be considered incomplete. a canvas left blank in a world full of stories. But colonialism, as it often does, tried to erase it all. Missionaries arrived with scissors, soap, and shame. They saw the tattoos as primitive, pagan, and unchristian. In some areas, traditional tattooing was outlawed, forcing it underground like a sacred language spoken only in whispers. Still, the ink endured. Today, many Polynesians are reclaiming their tattoo heritage with pride. The ancient tools have returned, the designs have resurfaced, and across the Pacific you can hear the sound of tattoo once again, not just as an art form, but as an act of cultural survival. These weren't just marks on the skin. They were, and still are, declarations of spirit, blood, and belonging. Step into the world of togas, gladiators, and philosophers, and you might not expect to find tattoos. After all, when we think of ancient Greece and Rome, we imagine marble statues and clean, idealized bodies. But peel back the myth and you'll find ink lurking in shadows. In ancient Greece, tattoos were originally associated with slaves and criminals. In fact, the Greek word stigma. Yes, the root of our modern term stigmatizes, referred to the permanent marks branded or inked into someone's skin as punishment. These weren't symbolic or decorative. They were labels, warnings. If you were a runaway slave or a captured enemy, your captor might tattoo your forehead with a message like, "Stop me, I ran away," a permanent scarlet letter etched into the skin. The Romans, pragmatic as ever, borrowed this idea and took it further. Soldiers in the Roman army, especially those in specialized legions, were often tattooed to mark their loyalty, a kind of flesh-bound dog tag. But they also used tattoos to brand gladiators, slaves, and prisoners of war. It wasn't about identity, it was about ownership. There's a darker twist here. The early Christians, persecuted by Roman authorities, were sometimes tattooed as a form of humiliation, but centuries later, Christians would reclaim the practice. Pilgrims to Jerusalem in the Middle Ages often returned with small crosses tattooed on their arms, proof of their devotion and suffering. What began as a tool of punishment morphed into a badge of faith. Interestingly, in later Roman times, Emperor Constantine, the same ruler who legalized Christianity, banned tattooing on the face, not because it was cruel, but because the face, he declared, was made in God's image and shouldn't be defiled. The irony? Bodies were still fair game. Unlike in Polynesia, where tattoos elevated someone's social standing in the Greco-Roman world, they often lowered it. Tattoos marked you as an outsider, a sinner, a slave, but they also told a story. Not always one you wanted, but one you carried forever. In these empires of law, conquest, and spectacle, tattoos weren't about self-expression. They were branding. Sometimes literally tools of control, punishment, and power. And like all marks of oppression, they would eventually be reclaimed. While the West branded its slaves and criminals, the East took a more spiritual, symbolic approach to body art, where tattoos could be both sacred protection and social paradox. Let's begin in India. Though India is more famous for Mehndi, the temporary henna art applied during weddings and festivals, the country also has a long history of permanent tattoos. Among tribal communities like the Baiga, Gondi, and Sandhau, tattoos were considered both ornamental and protective. A woman might be tattooed with symbols of fertility, strength, or religious devotion, not on a whim, but as part of a deeply rooted tradition passed from grandmother to granddaughter. These tattoos weren't just for beauty, they were seen as jewelry for the soul, something no thief could steal and no poverty could take away. Meanwhile, in Japan, the story was more complicated. In the early days, during the Jomon period, tattoos might have had spiritual significance, possibly used to mark status or ward off evil spirits. But by the time Japan entered its more structured eras, particularly during the Edo period, tattooing took on a whole new life. First, it became a punishment. Criminals were tattooed on the face or arm with marks indicating their crime and region, permanently branding them as untrustworthy. Imagine walking into a village and everyone instantly knowing your sins just by reading your skin. But then something fascinating happened. A counterculture emerged. Outcasts, including firemen, laborers, and later members of the Yakuza, adopted tattoos not as shame, but as honor. They created elaborate full-body designs called irizumi, often depicting dragons, tigers, and mythological figures. These were masterpieces, carved into the flesh over hundreds of painful hours. Each design told a story, a personal legend inked beneath society's judgment. At the same time, Buddhist pilgrims in Southeast Asia developed sapient tattoos, geometric designs, and Pali scriptures believed to offer protection, strength, and spiritual blessings. These were administered by monks using sharpened bamboo or steel rods and always accompanied by chants and prayer. In the East, tattoos could be holy or taboo, sacred or criminal. It all depended on who wore them and why. But one thing was certain. In these cultures, skin was never silent. It spoke of power, punishment, prayer, and pride. As the Roman Empire gave way to the rise of Christianity, the tattoo needle, once a symbol of identity or punishment, began to vanish from the Western world. Why? Because in the eyes of the church, the body was no longer just flesh. It was a temple. And temples apparently weren't meant to be scribbled on. The early Christians had a complex relationship with tattoos. On one hand, some groups adopted tattoos as declarations of faith. Pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem would have small crosses tattooed on their wrists to signify their devotion, a permanent spiritual passport. These were symbols of endurance and survival, proof they had made the sacred journey and lived to tell the tale. But that was the exception, not the rule. By the early Middle Ages, the dominant message coming from religious authorities was clear. Marking the body was a pagan practice, and pagan meant sinful. The Bible, specifically Leviticus 19:28, was often cited. You shall not make any cuttings in your flesh for the dead, nor tattoo any marks upon you. I am the Lord. That single line was enough to bury an entire art form across much of medieval Europe. Tattoos became synonymous with heathenism, witchcraft, and heresy, not something you wanted associated with your name during the Inquisition. In monasteries and Christian kingdoms, tattooing virtually disappeared, reduced to whispers and superstition. But even in this era of suppression, the ink never truly dried. In the far reaches of the Byzantine Empire, some Christian sects still practiced religious tattooing, small crosses etched onto hands and arms, often to protect against Islamic enslavement. In Ethiopia, Coptic Christians maintained tattoo traditions as well, marking young believers with sacred symbols as part of spiritual rituals. And among Crusaders, the knights who marched to the Holy Land, tattoos made a quiet return. Some etched small crosses on their bodies, not just as spiritual protection, but so that if they died in battle, they could be buried as Christians, their faith visible even in death. So while the medieval W tried to erase the art of tattooing, it never quite succeeded. The ink hid in monasteries, pilgrim trails, and desert churches, waiting patiently like a buried relic for its time to rise again. As the age of exploration dawned and wooden ships began slicing through unknown oceans, tattoos found a brand new canvas for sailors. And these weren't royal court artists or tribal shamans. These were rough men, calloused by salt and superstition, who began decorating their bodies with anchors, mermaids, and crucifixes. But how did tattoos return to Europe after centuries in exile? Enter the 18th century voyages of Captain James Cook. When his crew arrived in Polynesia, they encountered entire societies marked in ink. Intrigued and amazed, many sailors got tattooed themselves, both to honor the cultures they encountered and, let's be honest, to prove they'd been somewhere exotic. Returning to port with tattoos wasn't just fashionable. It was a kind of resume, a living record of where you'd sailed and what you'd survived. Soon, tattoos became the unofficial uniform of the seafaring class. But it wasn't just about style. It was steeped in superstition. An anchor on the forearm symbolized stability. A pig and a rooster, often tattooed on the feet, were believed to prevent drowning, since those animals were kept in wooden crates that floated during shipwrecks. Some sailors even tattooed "Hold Fast" across their knuckles, hoping it would give them the grip to survive rough seas and tangled ropes. And then there were the religious icons, crosses on the back, the Virgin Mary over the heart. Sailors believed these tattoos offered divine protection, an extra layer of spiritual armor when the ocean turned against them. As these inked-up sailors filtered back into European and American ports, tattoos spread with them, not to the nobility, but to the fringes, dock workers, soldiers, convicts. Tattoos were now the language of the lower classes, the drifters, and the daring. Still, they held meaning. In the US, Civil War soldiers began tattooing their names and regiments on their arms, a grim preparation in case they died in battle and needed identification. A small, painful insurance policy in a world without dog tags. So while kings and clergy shunned tattoos, the men who mapped the world wore them with pride. For them, each mark was a story, a wound, a charm, a prayer. And when the world ended in waves or cannon fire, it might be the only thing left that told your name. By the 19th and 20th centuries, tattoos had drifted far from temples and tribal rites. In many parts of the world, they had become marks of defiance, especially behind bars. Prisons gave tattoos a new language, a gritty, coded one, spoken in needles, razors, and improvised ink. Let's start in Russia. Under the iron shadow of the Soviet Union, a secret society of tattoos flourished inside the gulags. These weren't decorative. They were biographical, symbolic, ruthlessly hierarchical. A star on the shoulders. That meant you commanded respect. Barbed wire around the neck. You were a lifer, never getting out. A cathedral with domes on your chest. Each dome represented a sentence served. The tattoos told your crimes, your rank, your defiance. But break the code or wear a symbol you hadn't earned, and you might find it carved off. Forced with a knife in Japan, the Yakuza transformed the art of Irizumi, once a punishment, into a badge of honor. Full-body suits of dragons, koi fish, and samurai warriors, covered skin from shoulder to ankle, often hidden beneath business suits. Getting tattooed wasn't just an act of rebellion. It was a rite of loyalty, painful, expensive, and permanent. In the West, prison tattoos carry their own meanings. In American jails, a teardrop beneath the eye might signal that you've committed murder, or in some cases lost someone close. Cobwebs on the elbows could symbolize long sentences, dots on the knuckles, numbers, acronyms, entire identities rewritten in ink, hidden from guards, but clear to anyone fluent in the language. These tattoos were often done with smuggled sewing needles, paper clips, and pins melted into ink. There was no glamour here, just pain and symbolism. For many inmates, it was less about art and more about identity, proof that you belonged, or a warning that you didn't. Outside prison walls, these tattoos carried a heavy stigma. They marked you as dangerous, untouchable, beyond redemption. But for the men and women who wore them, the ink was often the only constant, the only part of themselves they owned in a system built to strip everything else away. Tattoos in prison weren't fashion, they were survival. By the time the 20th century hit full stride, tattoos had gone from sacred symbols and outlaw code to mainstream rebellion. If the church once saw tattoos as marks of sin, modern society started to see them as symbols of freedom, and occasionally of a very specific kind of cool. In the early 1900s, you could still catch tattooed performers in circus sideshows, tattooed ladies and illustrated men who charged admission to show off their fully inked skin. People gasped. They stared. It was taboo, wrapped in spectacle. But something began to shift around the middle of the century. Soldiers returning from World War II brought back simple tattoos, anchors and eagles. Hearts with moms scrawled inside as personal emblems of pain, patriotism, or survival. These tattoos weren't for show. They were keepsakes burned into the skin as reminders of the things they'd seen and the brothers they'd lost. Then came the counterculture. In the 1960s and 70s, tattoos began breaking out of their blue-collar roots and onto the bodies of rock stars, bikers, and beat poets. Janis Joplin had a bracelet tattooed on her wrist. The Hells Angels wore ink like a badge of honor. The act of getting a tattoo, still a bit frowned upon by polite society, became an act of rebellion. A way to say I don't care what you think in tattoo parlors. They were no longer hidden dens in seedy alleyways. They started to go legit. Artists like Lyle Tuttle, who famously inked Cher and the Rolling Stones, turned the needle into a brush. Suddenly, tattoos weren't just symbols. They were statements. Personal, political, powerful. But the stigma didn't vanish overnight. Even into the 1990s and early 2000s, having visible tattoos could keep you from getting hired. No visible tattoos were printed right into many job applications. Ink still whispered of crime, deviance, or recklessness, especially for women whose tattooed bodies were policed more harshly. And yet the tide was turning. Tattoo TV shows emerged. Celebrities embraced full sleeves. Tattoo conventions popped up everywhere. The art form was no longer a subculture. It was culture. From rebellion to runway, tattoos had finally re-entered the mainstream. But they never forgot their roots in a world where everything from our voices to our memories lives in the cloud. You think something as analog as a tattoo might be left behind. But instead, tattoos have entered a renaissance, not just surviving the digital age, but evolving with it. Today, tattoos are more than ink and skin. They're powered by apps, augmented by tech, and designed with machines that would make 19th century sailors weep. Some artists now use AI to generate hyper-detailed designs. Others work with machines that print ink with surgical precision. And then there's the rise of smart tattoos, experimental patches embedded with sensors, capable of tracking vitals, controlling devices, or even lighting up with LED ink. It's not science fiction. It's already being tested in labs. But even without the tech, tattoos are booming. What was once taboo is now celebrated across professions, genders, and cultures. Doctors have full sleeves. Teachers wear wristbands of ink. CEOs stroll into boardrooms with elaborate back pieces hidden beneath suits. Social media has democratized the art form. A tattoo in Seoul can go viral in Seattle. Artists build global audiences overnight, and customers can book a session with a tap of a phone. And yet, the meaning behind tattoos hasn't disappeared. If anything, it's become more personal. People now tattoo sound waves of loved ones' voices, coordinates of where they met their partners, portraits of pets, constellations from their child's birth night, quotes in forgotten languages etched forever to remember, to heal, to belong. Cultural tattooing is resurging too. Indigenous communities from the Arctic to the Andes are reviving ancestral designs, reclaiming identity through skin. What was once suppressed is now proudly worn, a walking act of remembrance. Of course, debates still rage. Is it art or trend? Sacred or superficial? Can you truly own your story if it's filtered through algorithms and likes? But maybe that's the point. Tattoos have always lived in that gray area between pain and beauty, permanence and transformation. They are both primal and futuristic, a whisper from the past and a declaration for tomorrow. And as long as humans crave meaning, memory, and mark-making, tattoos will endure. Beneath the surface, ink will always speak, even when words cannot. Before empires clashed and blood soaked the sand, before kings trembled at her name, Tamiris was simply a daughter of the wind. Born to the raw, open steppe, the land she came from was not gilded in marble or echoing with philosophy. It was brutal, free, and endlessly vast. This was the world of the Massage Te, fierce nomadic horse archers who rode like spirits of the plains, their lives shaped by survival, honor, and war. We know little of Tamiris' childhood, but we can imagine the rhythm of it. She would have learned to ride before she could run to shoot, before she could speak in full sentences. Among the Massage, girls were not caged in tents or veiled by silence. They trained beside the boys, rode with the warriors, and grew up with iron in their blood. To lead, one had to bleed, and Tamiris, even as a young woman, bled for her people. Her tribe worshipped the sun and sky, lived off their herds, and buried their dead with weapons, ready for battle in the afterlife. They had no cities, no golden temples, but they had pride. And when enemies approached, they met them not with prayers, but with arrows. Tamiris likely came to power after the death of her husband, who may have ruled the tribe before her. But what's certain is that when the moment came, she didn't inherit leadership. She seized it. In a time when most women were considered property, Tamiris commanded an army. She negotiated with kings. She dared to speak as an equal, and if they didn't listen, she made them. She was more than a queen. She was Shamat, the steppe's checkmate, a war chief in bronze and leather who would soon face the greatest empire on earth. But power, especially for a woman, never comes without consequence. As Tamiris began to solidify her rule, whispers grew louder. Across the mountains to the south, a king was watching. His name was Cyrus the Great, and he wanted more. The stage was set, the steppe wind howled, and Tamiris, daughter of warriors, would soon ride into legend. While Tamiris reigned over the open steppes far to the south, a different kind of power was rising: structured, imperial, relentless. Cyrus the Great, founder of the Achaemenid Empire, had already conquered Lydia in the west and Babylon in the south. His banners flew over deserts, mountains, and cities, where languages changed every few days' ride. But Cyrus wasn't done. He was a builder of empires, and every builder eventually eyes the horizon. To Cyrus, the Massagete was a threat wrapped in opportunity. They weren't rich in gold or cities, but they controlled the northeastern frontier, and that meant access to key lands, resources, and trade routes. More importantly, the Massagete had something no empire could afford to ignore: pride. And pride, in Cyrus's eyes, could be bent or broken. But Cyrus also knew that brute force wasn't always the best first move. He had a reputation for cleverness, diplomacy, and strategic trickery. So he tried a different approach, one that kings before him had used to dissolve threats without a single drop of blood. He proposed marriage. According to ancient sources, notably Herodotus, Cyrus sent envoys to Tamiris offering an alliance through matrimony. On paper, it was a royal match: the great king of Persia and the warrior queen of the Massagete. But Tamiris wasn't naive. She saw the proposal for what it was: not an offer of love or partnership, but a calculated attempt to absorb her people without a fight. She declined, and that rejection didn't sit well in the halls of Persepolis. With the diplomatic games over, Cyrus shifted to his favorite language: war. He ordered his army to cross the Araxes River, the natural barrier that separated Persia from the land of the Massagete. He was going to take what Tamiris refused to give. But Tamiris was already preparing. She knew the terrain. She knew how her people fought on horseback, fast and furious. And most of all, she knew Cyrus wasn't just coming for land. He was coming to crush a woman who dared to say no. The world's most powerful king had declared war, but he had no idea what kind of fury he had just awakened on the steppe. Cyrus the Great, master strategist and seasoned conqueror, believed he could outwit Tamiris. He had faced kings, crushed cities, and subdued nations. To him, the Massagete were little more than wild nomads with fast horses and no cities to defend. He didn't realize he was stepping into the path of someone just as cunning and far more furious. Tamiris had warned him. After rejecting his marriage offer, she sent a clear message: cross the Araxes River, and you will regret it. But Cyrus crossed anyway, building a bridge of boats to carry his army into Massagete land. Instead of striking immediately, Tamiris pulled her forces back, luring Cyrus deeper into unfamiliar terrain. The Persians found an abandoned camp, well stocked with food and, more importantly, wine, a luxury the nomadic Massagete rarely indulged in. It was a baited trap, and Cyrus took it, perhaps thinking the enemy had panicked and fled. Inside the camp, he left a portion of his army under the command of General Harpagus, a trusted officer. As the Massagete returned under the cover of night, they fell upon the drunk and unsuspecting Persians with deadly precision. The battle was brutal and swift. Among the dead was Spargapises, Tamiris' son, and a Massagete commander. Accounts differ on what happened next. Some say Spargapises was taken alive and, realizing his capture, begged for death and took his own life. Others claim he was killed in the fighting, but all agree. When news reached Tamiris, something inside her shattered and then turned to steel. Her grief was volcanic, but her rage became legendary. She sent another message to Cyrus. This one wasn't a warning, it was a vow. You may be a glutton for blood, she said, but I swear I will give you your fill. She promised to make the ground run red with Persian blood, and her vengeance would not be quiet. Cyrus had taken her son. He had violated her land. Now he would meet not the queen of the Massagete, but the mother of a slain warrior and the last face he would ever see. The next battle would not be a skirmish. It would be an execution. The sun rose over the plains like a blade, sharp and blinding. Tamiris stood at the head of her army, no longer just a queen, but a storm-given form. Her warriors, hardened by the nomadic life, painted their faces with ash and rage. This wasn't about politics anymore. This was about blood. Cyrus, for all his might, had underestimated the Massagete. He assumed they would fight like the tribes he had conquered before. Chaotic, uncoordinated, easy to crush. But Tamiris had spent her life among warriors. She understood how to strike, not blindly, but with precision. She rallied her forces for a full-scale assault on the Persian invaders, and this time she wasn't holding back. The location of the final battle is lost to history, swallowed by the vastness of the steppe. But what's clear is that Tamiris launched a ferocious counterattack. Her cavalry swept across the plains like a tide of knives. They fired arrows from horseback, closed in with axes, and fought like people with nothing left to lose. The Persians, battle-hardened, disciplined, and experienced, weren't expecting this level of organized fury. Tamiris didn't just lead her troops, she fought beside them. Her presence on the battlefield ignited her warriors like wildfire. Every strike was driven by vengeance. Every charge was an answer to her son's death. Cyrus tried to hold the line, but it shattered. The Persians were routed. Many died where they stood. Others fled into the endless grasslands, only to be hunted down. And Cyrus the Great, the man who had conquered Babylon, Lydia, and nearly the known world, fell into chaos. Whether he was slain in combat or captured and executed depends on the version told. But either way, he died on Tamiris' terms. What came next is infamous. According to Herodotus, Tamiris found Cyrus's body on the battlefield, ordered his head severed, and then in a final act of symbolic revenge, submerged it in a wineskin filled with human blood. "Drink your fill," she said, "of the blood you thirsted for." Was it historical fact or poetic embellishment? Maybe both. But it didn't matter. The message was eternal. Tamiris was not to be conquered. When the dust settled and the grass drank deep the blood of empire, Tamiris stood victorious, a warrior queen who had done what no king or army before her could. She brought Cyrus the Great to his end. News of the defeat sent shock waves across the ancient world. The mighty Achaemenid Empire, thought to be unstoppable, had been humiliated by a woman from the steppes. The Persians did their best to downplay the loss. But the death of their founder couldn't be ignored. Cyrus's body was eventually returned and buried with honor in the royal tomb at Pasargadae. Yet the stain of his final defeat would linger like a wound on the empire's legacy. For Tamiris and the Massagetae, however, the victory was more than revenge. It was a declaration. They had defended their sovereignty, not just with weapons, but with dignity. Tamiris had stood up to the world's most powerful ruler. And she hadn't just survived. She had triumphed. And then she vanished from history. No record survived detailing her later years, her death, or any successes she may have appointed. It's as if, after taking her vengeance, Tamiris simply rode back into the horizon and allowed the wind to carry her legend forward. In the centuries that followed, historians, poets, and chroniclers would try to fill in the blanks, turning her into a symbol as much as a woman. To the Persians, her name is a bitter reminder. To the Greeks, she was a paradox, a barbarian who displayed more nobility than many kings. And to the peoples of Central Asia, Tamiris became folklore, a ghostly queen who rides through the steppe, fierce and unbending, with a sword that remembers. Her legacy would inspire countless depictions across cultures. Medieval manuscripts portrayed her in regal armor. Renaissance paintings imagined her towering over Cyrus's corpse. In every age, she became what people needed. A mother avenger, a wild queen, a lesson in hubris, or a symbol of feminine power. But one truth cuts through the myth. She changed history. Tamiris didn't inherit a throne. She forged it in fire and fury. And for one brief, unforgettable moment, the Steppe Queen proved that not all empires rise. Some fall to the hooves of warriors who ride with vengeance in their hearts. Much of what we know about Tamiris comes not from local message records. They left no stone tablets or royal archives, but from the pen of a Greek Herodotus, often called the father of history. Writing a century after her time, he immortalized Tamiris in his histories, casting her as a warrior queen of astonishing resolve and terrifying vengeance. But Herodotus wasn't simply reporting facts. He was weaving a story, one part chronicle, one part morality tale. To him and his Greek audience, Tamiris represented the ultimate reversal of imperial arrogance. Cyrus the Great, a man who had conquered half the known world, fell not to a vast army or a rival king, but to a woman who fought not for glory, but for her child. Her victory was almost mythic, and Herodotus treated it as such. He even detailed her grisly revenge, the wineskin of blood, the severed head of Cyrus, and her damning words, "Drink your fill." But was it true? Modern historians debate this endlessly. Some argue that Herodotus exaggerated or even invented parts of the tale, using Tamiris as a narrative tool to humble the Persian Empire, which, at the time of his writing, was still a looming force over the Greek world. Others believe that while the blood wineskin episode might be symbolic, the core event Cyrus's death at the hands of Tamiris likely did happen. There's also the question of bias. Herodotus, for all his insight, often filtered foreign cultures through a Greek lens. He portrayed the Massagite as wild and free, yet noble, an exotic mirror to Greek ideals of honor and liberty. Tamiris, in that frame, wasn't just a barbarian. She was a moral counterweight to Persian ambition. Still, even if details blurred over time, Herodotus succeeded in one thing. He ensured Tamiris would not be forgotten. Because of him, she became more than a historical footnote. She entered the realm of legend, where facts soften but impact sharpens, and in that space between myth and memory, Tamiris' story found a strange kind of immortality. In a world dominated by kings and conquerors, Herodotus left us a queen who refused to kneel and left her enemies bleeding in the sand. Though she may have slain one of the ancient world's most iconic emperors, Tamiris never ruled an empire herself. She didn't build cities of stone or inscribe edicts on golden tablets. Her people, the Musageet, were nomads, living not by walls, but by the rhythms of the land, the sky, and the horse. This meant that Tamiris's legacy was never institutionalized. There were no marble busts or royal coins bearing her likeness, no archives to immortalize her decrees. Instead, her story passed on as stories do on the steppe through firelight, song, and the whispered awe of warriors. The Musageet were one of many powerful tribes of the Central Asian steppes. Their cousins included the Scythians, the Saka, and the Dahai, all expert horse archers who roamed the lands between the Caspian Sea and the borders of ancient China. These tribes were feared by empires for their mobility, unpredictability, and ferocity in battle. Tamiris, as a female leader among them, was a rare, but not entirely unique steppe culture. Unlike many sedentary civilizations, allowed women far greater freedoms. Women rode, hunted, fought, and even led. Among the Scythians, graves of female warriors buried with weapons, armor, and horse gear have been found by archaeologists, confirming that the stories of fierce steppe queens were more than just legend. Tamiris stood at the pinnacle of that tradition. Her power didn't come from inheritance or religion, it came from respect, grit, and sheer capability. She was a unifying force among scattered clans, a political leader, and a military commander in a landscape where survival meant riding faster, shooting better, and fearing nothing. But because the Massagete left no monuments, Tamiris became a kind of phantom queen, her name echoing only in the writings of outsiders and in the oral traditions of the steppe. To the Persian scribes, she was a warning to the Greeks, a marvel, and to her people, likely a memory carried in bloodlines and battle songs, a ghost who rode with them across the plains. Empires may rise and fall in stone, but the stories of the steppe live on in the wind. And Tamiris, fierce, grieving, and unbroken, became its voice. Centuries passed, and the empires that once surrounded the Massagite rose and crumbled. Cyrus's successors built Persepolis, fought Alexander the Great, and faded into the dusty footnotes of time. But Tamiris, her legend endured not in the palaces of kings, but in the hearts of those who refused to bow. Across Central Asia, she became more than a queen. She became a symbol of female strength, of resistance, of the untamed spirit of the steppe in many ways. Tamiris embodied a kind of defiance that transcended geography. She was not Roman, not Greek, not Persian, and so her story belonged to no empire. That made her dangerous and inspiring. In the medieval Islamic world, chroniclers occasionally mention her name, reshaped by language, but never quite forgotten. In some versions, she was praised for her justice and vengeance. In others, she was seen as a savage queen, a reminder that power in the hands of a woman could be both glorious and terrifying. By the time the Renaissance rolled around, European artists rediscovered her tale through the writings of Herodotus. Painters depicted her in elaborate armor, standing triumphantly over Cyrus's lifeless body. In one dramatic painting, she holds his severed head aloft like a trophy, blood-soaked and victorious. It was theatrical, yes, but also political. These artists were fascinated by the idea of a woman who didn't just survive in a man's world. She won. In the 19th and 20th centuries, Tamiris became a nationalist icon in regions like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. Poets and educators reclaimed her as a historical heroine, proof that the roots of Central Asian identity were fierce, proud, and deeply feminine. Her name appeared in textbooks, statues, and even military ceremonies. A woman who had once ruled on horseback with a bow in hand was now riding once more through memory and myth, through rebellion and pride. In a world that still wrestles with the idea of powerful women, Tamiris remained a challenge. She wasn't perfect, saintly, or tame. She was decisive, brutal when necessary, compassionate only to those who deserved it. She was resistant in human form, and the blood of empire on her hands was a crown she wore without apology. History tends to favor the builders of monuments, the writers of laws, the kings who carved their names into stone. Tamiris did none of these. She left no empire behind, no palace to excavate, no royal seal to decipher. And yet her name still lives, not because she ruled forever, but because she refused to be erased. She stands as a contradiction to how history often remembers women, not as helpmates or footnotes, but as forces of destiny. Tamiris didn't beg for recognition. She took it with blood and fire. She didn't ride behind a king. She rode against one and one. Her story is retold in classrooms from Central Asia to Europe, not simply because she killed Cyrus the Great, but because she dared to defy him. She wasn't defending an empire. She was defending freedom, a freedom that rode on the backs of horses, that hunted with hawks, that slept under the stars, a freedom that could not be neatly drawn on a map. Today, her statues rise from Kazakhstan's capital cities, and her face adorns coins and textbooks. To modern Central Asians, she is a mother of nations, a link to a pre-Islamic, pre-Soviet, proudly nomadic past, a reminder that their identity wasn't born in submission, but in the cry of battle and the gallop of horses. In a world still divided by power, by gender, by memory, Tamiris is a beacon, not just because she killed a great king, but because she taught us something even greater. That dignity is not given. It is seized. That sometimes leadership looks like a mother grieving her son and refusing to let the killer walk away. We often wonder why some names survived while others vanish. Tamiris survived because she was unforgettable, because in a time when women were expected to disappear into the tents of men, she rose, blade in hand, fury in heart, and carved her story into the flesh of history. Empires fall, statues crumble, but legends ride, and somewhere in the whispering winds of the steppe, a queen still gallops, unbroken, undefeated, and utterly unforgettable. Long before encryption keys and surveillance cameras, there was a simpler concern. How do I keep my stuff safe from nosy neighbors, wandering animals, and ambitious thieves? As human societies shifted from nomadic bands to settled civilizations, possessions accumulated, and with possessions came problems, envy, theft, and the need to secure. The instinct to protect what we value is ancient, primal even. Once humans began storing food, tools, or sacred items in permanent dwellings or temples, they had to find a way to keep others out. But how do you guard something when you can't stand watch forever? The answer? Invent a mechanism to do it for you. The earliest known attempt at mechanical security dates back to ancient Egypt, roughly 4,000 years ago. And what's astonishing is not just that they had locks. It's that the basic principle behind their invention still exists today. The Egyptian wooden pin lock was a marvel of early engineering. It used a wooden bolt fitted with a set of holes and wooden pegs. When the correct key, often a large wooden tool with corresponding pins, was inserted, the pegs lifted, allowing the bolt to slide open. Remove the key and gravity dropped the pins back into place, sealing the door. This wasn't a novelty. These locks were used on storage rooms, tombs, and even temple gates. They were installed vertically, often on the inside of doors, to make tampering harder. While they may seem primitive by today's standards, the brilliance of these early systems lies in their underlying logic. They weren't merely barriers, they were puzzles. And like all good puzzles, they challenged the uninvited. What's more, these locks reveal something deeper about the people who made them. They didn't just fear theft. They anticipated it. They thought ahead. They invested time and skill in protecting things that mattered. And in doing so, they laid the groundwork for an entire field of human innovation security. So the next time you lock your front door, remember you're not just turning a deadbolt. You're continuing a tradition started by ancient hands, driven by a timeless truth. Some things are worth guarding. The Egyptian wooden pin lock wasn't just the world's first known lock. It was also the ancestor of nearly every pin tumbler mechanism used today. Simple, elegant, and surprisingly effective, it served temples, homes, and storage rooms across ancient Egypt for centuries. And it all started with a few pieces of wood, a bit of clever design, and a deep need for privacy. Imagine a large wooden door, not one with hinges like today's, but more like a vertical plank barrier. On the inside of that door sits a wooden bolt that slides horizontally to block the entrance. But embedded within that bolt are several holes, and inside each hole rests a wooden peg. Those pegs drop into slots cut into the door frame itself, preventing the bolt from sliding open. It's locked. Now here's the magic. The key, a large wooden implement resembling a modern toothbrush, has corresponding pegs or pins that match the positions of those in the bolt. Insert the key into the bolt, and the pins inside are pushed up just enough to clear the frame slots. Once lifted, the bolt can slide open freely. Remove the key and gravity does the rest. The pins fall back into the frame holes, relocking the door. It's mechanical memory without springs or gears, just wood, weight, and ingenuity. What made this system so impressive was its balance of complexity and reliability. It was relatively easy to craft using available materials, but hard to bypass without the correct key. And since each lock was slightly different thanks to hand carving, keys weren't interchangeable. Your lock was your lock. These pin locks weren't reserved just for the rich or royal either. Archaeological findings at sites like Nineveh, and even later at Persian and Assyrian locations, show the concept spread widely across ancient civilizations. Egypt may have invented the idea, but the lock had legs. Beyond practical use, these locks carried symbolic power. In tombs and sacred buildings, locking something wasn't just about physical protection. It signified reverence, finality, the belief that certain things should remain untouched unless you were worthy enough to possess the key. Security in ancient Egypt wasn't just a function, it was a statement. While Egypt gave us the earliest mechanical locks, ancient Mesopotamia pioneered a very different form of security, one that relied less on mechanics and more on identity. In the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, security wasn't sealed with bolts and tumblers. It was pressed in clay with symbols, authority, and trust. The people of Mesopotamia, including the Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians, developed a method of securing goods not by locking them, but by making unauthorized access visibly impossible. How? With cylinder seals, small carved stone rollers engraved with unique images or inscriptions. These seals were rolled over wet clay, used to close containers' doors, or even official documents. Think of it as an ancient combination of a signature, a wax seal, and a barcode. Once impressed into the clay, the seal left behind a continuous pattern that could not be duplicated easily. If someone tampered with the seal, opened the container, broke the door latch, or unwrapped the tablet, it was obvious the broken clay told them. This approach was both simple and profound. In a world without padlocks or alarms, it focused on deterrence through visibility. The seal didn't stop you from opening something, it told the world that you had. High-ranking officials, merchants, and priests all had their own personalized cylinder seals, often passed down through generations. These seals carried such prestige that some people were even buried with them as status symbols and tools of the afterlife. But Mesopotamian security wasn't just about clay. They also secured temple treasuries and granaries using rope bindings that could only be removed by cutting, often tied with elaborate knots or seals that would clearly show tampering. The idea was always the same: make the risk of exposure more terrifying than the reward of theft. This concept of security as accountability, of linking access to a person's identity and social status, would echo for millennia. Even today, we log in with usernames, verify with signatures, and rely on records more than locks. In Mesopotamia, to protect something wasn't just to keep it hidden, it was to publicly proclaim who had the right to touch it. As ancient Greek city-states rose in wealth and complexity, so too did their need for personal security, from treasuries and temples to coin-filled storerooms and private homes. The Greeks faced the same age-old challenge. How do you keep things safe when you can't always be there to guard them? Surprisingly, the Greeks were slower than their Egyptian and Mesopotamian neighbors in developing mechanical locks. Instead, they leaned heavily on trust, social norms, and physical barriers, sometimes reinforced by surprisingly clever, though rudimentary devices. One such innovation was the bar and pin lock. Used mostly for doors and chests, it consisted of a horizontal bar placed across a door on the inside, with a hole through which a key could be inserted from the outside to lift the bar. These keys were often large, flat iron rods shaped like the letter F or P. They weren't the most discreet. In fact, some were almost as long as a forearm. Carrying one around made it quite obvious that you had something to protect. But Greek keys and locks weren't just functional. They also held cultural significance. Being entrusted with a key symbolized authority and responsibility in Homer's Odyssey. Penelope is described as holding the key to Odysseus's storeroom, a symbol of her power within the household. However, Greek locks had limitations. They were often crude, easily forced, and dependent on physical size more than subtlety. What truly kept valuables secure was often a combination of concealment, guards, and communal expectations. In temples and state treasuries, rooms were sealed with rope and wax. With a city-state holding multiple keys, requiring several officials to be present to open a sacred store, even homes were designed with layered access, multiple rooms, limited entry points, and gates that could be barred from within. Wealthy homes might employ slaves or hire guards to watch over valuables, adding a human layer of protection to the relatively simple mechanical devices, while the Greeks admired cleverness, matisse, and cunning intelligence. They didn't yet channel it into lock-making the way later civilizations would. Still, they laid the cultural groundwork. Keys as symbols of status, access as a matter of trust, and security as a balance between strength and social control. If the Egyptians gave us the concept of the pin lock and the Greeks wove trust into tradition, it was the Romans who truly elevated lock-making into a practical art with their metallurgical skill, obsession with order, and vast bureaucracy. The Romans brought precision, portability, and innovation to ancient security, and their ideas still echo through modern locks today. Roman locks were primarily made of bronze and iron, allowing for much greater durability and smaller, more intricate designs than their wooden predecessors. They adopted the Egyptian pin tumbler principle, but miniaturized it, refined it, and in some cases, completely reinvented it. Roman locksmiths created warded locks which used internal obstacles or wards that only allowed a properly shaped key to rotate and unlock the mechanism. This meant that simply inserting any tool wouldn't work. The key had to match the internal layout. Their keys, by the way, were marvels in themselves. Made from iron or bronze, Roman keys came in all sizes, from large staff like keys used for city gates, to finely crafted ring keys worn on the finger like jewelry. These ring keys didn't just look elegant, they serve a functional purpose, offering constant access to locked boxes or cabinets without the need to carry bulky tools. It was status and utility wrapped in metal. But the real genius came with Roman puzzle locks, complex mechanisms hidden inside ornate boxes where pressing the wrong latch or turning the wrong angle wouldn't just fail. They might trap the lock tighter. These were used not only for securing valuables, but for hiding documents, religious relics, or even poison, a favorite trick in Roman political circles. Romans also institutionalized lock usage. Banks, granaries, merchant chests, and military storerooms all used locks. Doors had metal plates. Gates had locking bars, and even slaves might be locked in with iron collars that had keys only their masters held. To the Romans, a lock wasn't just a tool, it was a statement. It declared ownership, authority, and exclusion. And it gave rise to the idea that a truly civilized society needed more than just walls to protect it. It needed systems while the West was forging intricate metal locks. Ancient China took a path that blended practicality with philosophy. Chinese engineers, ever pragmatic, developed locking systems that were simple, durable, and often symbolic, where the design of a lock didn't just protect an object, but carried deeper meaning. The most common form of ancient Chinese lock was the sliding bolt lock, a mechanism made primarily from bronze or iron. These locks typically consisted of a hollow metal case housing a sliding bolt, secured by spring-loaded tumblers. Insert the right key, usually a flat, ridged metal stick, and the tumblers would align, allowing the bolt to slide and the lock to open. Sound familiar? It should. The core principle behind a modern pin tumbler lock was already alive in Han Dynasty China as early as 200 BCE. Unlike Roman locks, which often featured external keyholes and decorative flair, Chinese locks were compact, discreet, and portable. Many were used to secure chests, gates, jewelry boxes, and doors, and the emphasis was on function, not just form. But Chinese locks were more than mechanical devices. They were often cast in the shape of animals, tigers, dragons, turtles, or inscribed with symbols representing luck, protection, or wealth. A lock shaped like a fish might be placed on a money box, symbolizing abundance. A dragon lock on a door wasn't just for security. It warned intruders that a powerful force guarded what lay beyond. Locks also played ceremonial roles. During weddings, love locks were sometimes used to bind symbolic boxes or chests representing the couple's bond. The key would be handed over as part of the marriage ritual, a gesture of trust and commitment. Some locks, particularly puzzle locks, were designed to confuse thieves. They had hidden mechanisms, false keyholes, or required a specific sequence of movements to open, not because they were necessarily harder to break, but because they bought time. In ancient times, delay could be the difference between a foiled theft and a successful one. Ultimately, Chinese security culture wasn't built around brute denial of access, but rather harmony between utility, symbolism, and clever design. In that blend of form and function, they develop a quiet legacy, one that continues in subtle locks and symbolic rituals to this day. In ancient India, security was less about brute force and more about clever concealment, symbolic barriers, and layered protection, blending spirituality with ingenuity. Indian locks weren't just meant to keep people out. They were designed to confuse, mislead, and warn, often integrating secret latches, false compartments, or symbolic inscriptions to elevate security into an almost philosophical practice. One of the standout features of Indian lockmaking was the use of deception. Puzzle locks and trick mechanisms became common in temples and treasure chests, not to prevent brute force entry entirely, but to make it complicated enough to discourage it. Some locks required multiple actions. Press one hidden button, twist a second lever, and only then would the key turn. Others had decoy keyholes that served no purpose except to trick the uninvited. Temple security especially saw intricate applications. Temples housed offerings of gold, sacred texts, and revered relics. Instead of simply hiding these behind locked doors, priests often layered security not just physically, but ritually. A storage area might be sealed with wax, knotted rope, and a stamped clay emblem, each bearing spiritual weight. Breaking that seal wasn't just a crime, it was considered a sacrilege. Locks themselves were frequently engraved with religious imagery, elephants, lotus flowers, deities, and protective mantras. These were not only meant to intimidate the superstitious, but also to imbue the object with symbolic armor. To touch such a lock without permission was, in many cases, an affront to the gods themselves. In Indian royal courts and merchant caravans, small portable locks were used to secure scrolls, trade boxes, and private doors. These were often crafted from iron or brass, built to be both light and durable. Key design was highly individualized, sometimes so unique that a single artisan was responsible for both the lock and its matching key, ensuring absolute security through obscurity. And like elsewhere in Asia, locks sometimes carried ceremonial roles. In marriage rituals or inheritance rites, the unlocking of a sealed chest represented not just access to material wealth, but the transfer of trust, legacy, and duty. For ancient India, the best lock didn't merely block. It puzzled, it protected, and it whispered only the rightful may pass. As civilizations grew and trade routes stretched from Rome to China, the need for portable security became urgent. Whether protecting goods in a merchant's caravan or safeguarding a general's war chest, ancient locks had to do more than guard temples or doors. They had to travel. In the ancient world, trade was booming. Silk moved westward from China. Spices flowed from India, glassware. Textiles, coins, and scrolls crisscrossed continents. But with prosperity came risk. Bandits lurked on roads, dishonest porters pilfered goods, and long-distance travel meant that valuables changed hands, often without their owner present. The solution? Locks that were compact, durable, and hard to tamper with. Roman merchants often used small iron padlocks to secure chests, saddlebags, and warehouse doors. These locks had spring-loaded mechanisms and ring keys, robust enough to resist casual theft, but light enough for travel. They were found from Britain to Syria, buried in ruins or rusted shut in shipwrecks. Their widespread presence speaks to a universal concern, protecting mobile wealth. Chinese traders and officials used portable sliding locks, often made of bronze, attached to chests or carts. Some were cleverly disguised, appearing ornamental or embedded within the box itself, and often featured engraved symbols or inscriptions marking ownership. If someone broke the lock, it was not only obvious, it could be prosecuted as both a crime and a dishonor. Nomadic peoples across Central Asia also developed leather and metal clasp systems, where metal rings and latches could be tied or locked over tent flaps, horse packs, and weapon cases, while these systems were less complex. They emphasized speed and visibility. A traveler would immediately know if their goods had been touched. And on the battlefield, locks were often used on weapon caches, treasury wagons, and command tents. In war, controlling access was crucial, not just to resources but to information. Scrolls and maps were sometimes sealed in locked boxes, often with multi-key systems, requiring more than one officer to open them, an early version of two-factor authorization. Across cultures, one thing remained consistent. The more mobile the world became, the more ingenious locks had to be. The road brought opportunity, but it also brought risk, and ancient travelers met it not just with swords, but with keys. When we twist a key in a door today, or tap a code into a locked screen, we rarely think of the thousands of years of quiet ingenuity behind that simple motion. But every click, latch, and password. It is part of a story that began in the dust of Egyptian temples, in the bronze workshops of Rome, and along the silent trade routes that stitched the ancient world together. The legacy of ancient locks is not just mechanical, it's psychological. These early inventions reflect something deeply human. Our desire to protect, to exclude, to define what is ours, whether it was a wooden bolt in Thebes, a ring key in Pompeii, or a puzzle lock in Chang'an. The concept was the same, to create a boundary that only the rightful person could cross. And over time, these boundaries evolved into more than physical barriers. They became symbols. A lock on a temple door didn't just secure gold, it preserved the sacred. A seal on a scroll didn't just hide knowledge, it marked power. Even today we use locks to mark trust. A locked diary, a wedding chest, a secure vault. The mechanism may be more advanced, but the meaning is the same. In many ways, the most remarkable thing about ancient security is how little has changed. Modern pin tumbler locks still mirror Egyptian designs. Today's privacy seals, passcodes, and even blockchain security echo ancient ideas, personal access, tamper-proofing, and symbolic control. But there's a philosophical twist, too. Ancient locks were never foolproof. They could be picked, broken, or bypassed, just like today. But their power lay not just in denying entry, but in declaring boundaries. They told the world, "This is mine. You do not have permission." And that psychological line, more than any mechanical part, is the essence of security, from tombs to trade routes, from temples to homes. Locks have always been about more than theft prevention. They're about control, identity, secrecy, and sometimes survival. So the next time you slide a deadbolt or hear a safe click shut, remember, you're not just using a tool. You're continuing a story written by kings, merchants, warriors, and priests, each of them trusting a small piece of technology to hold back the world.